Medieval England's royal households lived lives of stunning luxury, while following rules so strict they would seem impossible today. Their world shaped our modern ideas about power, chivalry, and even Christmas traditions. Yet beneath the glittering ceremonies lay family betrayals, deadly political games, and the constant threat of violent death. Tonight, as you settle in, we'll explore how these remarkable royal families survived in one of history's most dangerous times. The year was 1066. King Edward the Confessor lay dying in his palace at Westminster. His breath came in short gasps. The most powerful men in England crowded around his bed. Each one watched his lips carefully. They waited for him to name his successor. But Edward had a terrible problem. He had no children. For 24 years, Edward had ruled England peacefully. People called him the Confessor because of his deep religious faith. He spent hours praying in the abbey he was building. Today, we know it as Westminster Abbey. But Edward's piety created a dynastic disaster. His marriage to Edith of Wessex had produced no heirs. The dying king's morning routine had been strict for decades. He woke before dawn for prayers. Servants brought him bread soaked in wine for breakfast. He wore simple robes of undyed wool. Golden crowns made him uncomfortable. Edward preferred plain wooden crosses around his neck. His greatest fear wasn't invasion or rebellion. It was dying without naming a clear successor. 3 men believed they deserved the English throne. Harold Godwinson was Edward's brother-in-law. He controlled the most powerful noble family in England. William of Normandy claimed Edward had promised him the crown years earlier. Harold Hardrada of Norway said his family had ancient rights to rule England. Each man prepared for war. On January 5, 1066, Edward the Confessor died. Harold Godwinson acted fast. He convinced the nobles to crown him king immediately. The coronation happened the same day Edward was buried. This desperate speed revealed Harold's weakness. Legitimate kings didn't need to rush their coronations, but the heavens seemed angry about Harold's hasty crowning. In April 1066, people across England saw something terrifying in the night sky. A bright comet with a massive tail appeared. Today we call it Halley's Comet. Medieval people believed comets predicted disasters. They whispered that God was warning England about its new king. The comet's timing was perfect for Harold's enemies. William of Normandy declared that heaven itself opposed Harold's rule. Harold Hardrada gathered the largest Viking army in decades. Both men began planning invasions. Harold faced attacks from north and south simultaneously. Harold Hardrada struck first. In September 1066, his massive fleet sailed up the River Humber. Over 300 ships carried 15,000 Norwegian warriors. They looked like dragons emerging from the mist. Local English forces couldn't stop them. The Norwegians smashed through Yorkshire like a hurricane. Harold Godwinson made a desperate decision. He marched his army north at incredible speed. They covered 200 miles in just 4 days. Medieval armies normally moved 10 miles per day. Harold's men were exhausted but determined. Everything depended on stopping the Norwegian invasion quickly. The Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th was brutal. Harold's surprise attack caught the Norwegians unprepared. Many Vikings had left their armour on their ships. They fought in their underwear. Harold Hardrada died early in the fighting. An English arrow pierced his throat. His death broke Norwegian morale. The invasion collapsed completely, but Harold's victory came at a terrible cost. His army was exhausted and bloodied. Many of his best warriors lay dead. Worse news arrived before they could rest. William of Normandy had landed in southern England. Harold faced an impossible choice. His men needed weeks to recover. William wouldn't wait. The march from Stamford Bridge to Hastings was a death sentence. Harold's army covered another 250 miles in 2 weeks. They gathered new recruits along the way, but these men had no training or proper weapons. Many carried farming tools instead of swords. Harold knew he was leading them to slaughter. October 14th, 1066 changed English history forever. The Battle of Hastings began at 9 in the morning. Harold positioned his army on Senlac Hill. His men formed a shield wall across the ridge. Norman cavalry charged up the slope repeatedly. Each attack crashed against English shields like waves on rocks. But Harold's men were dying slowly. They had no cavalry of their own. Norman archers shot arrows high into the sky. The arrows fell like deadly rain behind English shields. Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine fell early in the battle. Their deaths shattered Harold's concentration. The battle's turning point came in the afternoon. Some Normans retreated down the hill. English soldiers broke formation to chase them. This was exactly what William had planned. Norman cavalry wheeled around and slaughtered the scattered English. The shield wall began cracking apart. Harold Godwinson died near sunset. Norman accounts claim an arrow hit his eye. English sources say Norman knights hacked him to pieces. Either way, England's last Anglo-Saxon king was dead. His body was so mutilated that his wife had to identify him by private birthmarks. William didn't celebrate his victory immediately. He knew winning one battle didn't make him king. Half of England still opposed him. The northern earls commanded fresh armies. London could resist a siege for months. William needed psychological warfare more than military conquest. William's cruelty in northern England shocked even his own supporters. Between 1069 and 1070, Norman armies destroyed everything between York and Durham. They burned crops, killed livestock, and salted the earth. Survivors called it the harrying of the north. Some villages remained empty for generations, but William's most lasting change was linguistic. Norman French became the language of power. English nobles had to learn French or lose their positions. Common people still spoke English at home, but French words entered everyday speech. We still use Norman words for meat today. Beef comes from Norman bouffe. Pork comes from pork. The Tancred family's story shows how conquest destroyed Saxon nobility. Earl Tancred had ruled lands in Lincolnshire for 30 years. His grandfather fought alongside King Alfred against the Vikings. After Hastings, William gave Tancred's estates to a Norman knight named Geoffrey de Montfort. Tancred became Geoffrey's servant on his own ancestral lands. Tancred's wife, Lady Elgifu, couldn't adapt to Norman rule. She refused to speak French or adopt Norman fashions. Her children learned to despise their parents' defeat. The eldest son Edgar joined every rebellion against William. He died fighting Normans at the Siege of Ely in 1071. The family line ended with him. William needed to know exactly what he had conquered. In 1085, he ordered a complete survey of England. Royal commissioners visited every village and manor. They counted people, animals, and ploughlands. The finished survey filled 2 massive volumes. English people called it the Domesday Book because it seemed like God's final judgment. The Domesday Book reveals fascinating details about medieval life. England had about 2 million people in 1086. Most lived in villages of 20-30 families. The average peasant owned 2 pigs, 1 cow, and 6 chickens. Lords owned vast estates but lived surprisingly simply. Even great castles had only 10-15 rooms. But William's sons inherited his kingdom's problems. His eldest son Robert Curthos ruled Normandy badly. His second son William Rufus became King of England. The brothers hated each other immediately. Civil war seemed inevitable. Then something mysterious happened in the New Forest. On August 2nd, 1100, King William Rufus went hunting in the New Forest. He never returned alive. A hunting arrow struck him in the chest. His companion Walter Tyrrell claimed it was an accident, but many suspected murder. William's younger brother Henry was hunting nearby that day. He raced to Winchester and seized the royal treasury before William's body was cold. Henry the Roan's quick actions revealed how medieval kingship really worked. Legitimacy came from controlling key resources, not bloodline inheritance. The first king to reach the treasury and crown jewels usually won. Henry understood this perfectly. He secured his position before his older brother Robert could react. The feudal system that emerged under Henry I was brilliant in its simplicity. The king owned all land in England theoretically. He granted large estates to his most trusted supporters. These tenants-in-chief swore personal loyalty to the king. They provided military service and tax payments in return. But feudalism worked differently at each social level. Great lords divided their lands among lesser nobles called knights. Each knight received enough land to support a warhorse and armour. Knights swore loyalty to their lords, just as lords swore loyalty to the king. This created chains of personal relationships from the king down to individual villages. At the bottom were the peasants who actually worked the land. Most were villains, legally bound to their lord's manor. They couldn't leave without permission. Their children inherited their unfree status. But lords also couldn't evict them arbitrarily. Everyone had rights and responsibilities within the feudal contract. A typical peasant's day began before sunrise. John the miller woke at 4 a.m. to start grinding grain. His wife Emma fed their 3 children porridge made from barley. They ate with wooden spoons from clay bowls. Meat appeared on their table maybe twice a year. Their cottage had 1 room with a dirt floor and no windows. Compare this to Earl Roger de Montgomery's morning routine. He woke at 6 a.m. in a private chamber hung with tapestries. Servants brought him white bread, cheese and wine for breakfast. He ate from silver plates with an ivory-handled knife. His castle had over 50 rooms. Private chapels allowed him to hear mass without mixing with commoners. The medieval church controlled everyone's daily life regardless of social class. Church bells marked the hours for work and prayer. Priests decided who could marry whom. They controlled education and health care. People who defied church teaching faced excommunication. This meant social death in medieval society. Marriage worked very differently for nobles and peasants. Great lords arranged their children's marriages to form political alliances. Love was irrelevant and often dangerous. But peasant couples could choose their own spouses usually. They still needed their lord's permission, but genuine affection was possible at lower social levels. Women's roles varied dramatically by class. Noble ladies managed huge households and sometimes ruled estates alone. They could own property and make legal contracts, but they couldn't inherit titles usually. Peasant women worked in fields alongside men. They had fewer legal rights but more practical independence. The Plantagenet dynasty's arrival in 1154 would transform this carefully balanced system. Henry II brought new ideas about royal power from France. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, the richest woman in Europe. Their vast territories stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees Mountains. This continental empire would create new problems and opportunities. But that story begins with a young man who believed kings should have absolute power over their subjects. Henry II would test the feudal system's limits. His reign would prove that even the most carefully constructed political arrangements could collapse when personalities clashed too violently. The medieval world that emerged from the Norman conquest would last for centuries. Its basic structures shaped English society until the Tudor period. Kings still needed noble support to rule effectively. Lords still controlled local justice and military service. The church still provided education and spiritual guidance. But within this framework, individual ambitions and family quarrels would write some of history's most dramatic chapters. In 1152, the most powerful woman in Europe made a shocking decision. Eleanor of Aquitaine had just divorced the King of France. She was 30 years old and controlled more land than most kings. Within 8 weeks, she married a teenage boy named Henry Plantagenet. He was 11 years younger than her. People called her crazy. They were wrong. Henry and Eleanor's wedding was a political earthquake. She brought him the rich lands of Aquitaine and Poitou. He already controlled Normandy and Anjou through his father. When Henry became King of England in 1154, their empire stretched from Scotland to the Spanish border. No English king had ever ruled so much territory, but their marriage was built on mutual ambition, not love. Eleanor had learned to hate weakness from her first husband, Louis VII of France. Louis was pious and boring. He treated Eleanor like a nun instead of a queen. Henry was everything Louis wasn't. He was energetic, brilliant, and ruthlessly ambitious. Eleanor saw him as her path to real power. Henry's daily routine revealed his manic energy. He woke at dawn and immediately began working. He ate meals while dictating letters to clerks. His court followed him across England and France constantly. Servants packed and unpacked royal belongings every few days. Henry couldn't sit still for 5 minutes. Some people whispered he was possessed by demons. The Plantagenet family crest showed why people feared them. It featured a golden lion on red background. But gossips claimed the family descended from a demon woman named Melusine. She could take human form but had cloven hooves. People said that explained Henry's terrifying temper tantrums and his son's evil nature. Henry's friendship with Thomas Becket seemed impossible from the start. Becket was the son of a London merchant. Henry was born to rule an empire, but they shared a love of learning, hunting, and political strategy. When Henry made Becket Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, he expected his friend to help him control the church. He was catastrophically wrong. Archbishop Becket transformed overnight from royal companion to religious fanatic. He wore hair shirts that made his skin bleed. He washed beggars' feet personally. Worst of all, he defied Henry's attempts to try criminal priests in royal courts. The friendship that had lasted 15 years exploded into public warfare. On December 29th, 1170, Henry's temper finally destroyed him. 4 knights overheard him shouting about Becket in his Norman castle. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" he screamed. The knights took this as a royal command. They sailed to England immediately. They found Becket praying in Canterbury Cathedral. They split his skull open with their swords. All of Europe blamed Henry for Becket's murder. The Pope threatened to excommunicate him. Louis VII prepared to invade Henry's French territories. Worst of all, Henry's own sons began plotting against him. Eleanor encouraged their rebellion secretly. She had grown to hate her husband's controlling nature. Eleanor's imprisonment began in 1173. Henry discovered she was funding their son's rebellion against him. He locked her in Winchester Castle under heavy guard. She would remain a prisoner for 16 years. But Eleanor was far too clever for simple imprisonment to stop her. She created a secret network of supporters across Europe. Even in prison, Eleanor influenced politics through coded letters. She used merchants and pilgrims to carry messages to her sons. Her supporters included troubadours who spread propaganda through popular songs. These ballads portrayed Henry as a tyrant who imprisoned his own wife. Eleanor's propaganda campaign turned public opinion against Henry. Henry's sons became known as the Devil's Brood for good reason. Henry the young king was crowned during his father's lifetime. This created endless confusion about who actually ruled England. Richard Plantagenet controlled Aquitaine through his mother's inheritance. Geoffrey ruled Brittany through marriage. John the youngest had no lands of his own. He was called Lackland mockingly. The royal brothers hated each other almost as much as they hated their father. Young Henry and Richard fought a private war in France for 2 years. Geoffrey switched sides constantly depending on who offered him more money. John spied on all his brothers for their father. Family dinners at Plantagenet courts must have been terrifying affairs. Life in Henry's court was luxurious but dangerous. Nobles wore silk imported from Constantinople. They ate from golden plates and drank wine from crystal goblets. Elaborate tournaments provided entertainment between political meetings. But courtiers also carried weapons constantly. Friendships could turn deadly overnight. One wrong word might mean exile or execution. Compare this to how ordinary English families lived under Henry's rule. William the Carpenter worked 14 hours daily building houses in London. His wife Joan raised 6 children in a 2-room cottage. They ate bread, porridge, and vegetables grown in their small garden. Meat was a rare luxury for special occasions. Their children played with wooden toys William carved himself. But Henry's legal reforms affected even humble families like William's. The king created royal courts that travelled throughout England. These courts used written records instead of local memory. They followed standard procedures rather than local customs. For the first time, a carpenter in London could expect the same justice as a farmer in Yorkshire. Henry also reformed England's financial system completely. He replaced feudal military service with monetary payments called scutage. Lords could pay money instead of providing knights for royal armies. This gave Henry professional soldiers rather than reluctant feudal levies. It also created England's first systematic tax collection system. The pipe rolls from Henry's reign show his government's incredible efficiency. Royal clerks recorded every penny collected across England. They tracked debts owed to the crown by individual nobles. They calculated exactly how many knights each lord owed for military service. Medieval England became Europe's most bureaucratic kingdom. But Henry's administrative genius couldn't solve his family problems. In 1183, young Henry died of dysentery during another rebellion against his father. Richard became the heir apparent immediately. He was everything young Henry wasn't. Richard was a brilliant military commander who lived for warfare. He had no interest in governing England peacefully. The relationship between Henry and Richard became poisonous after 1183. Richard suspected his father wanted to make John the heir instead. Henry demanded that Richard surrender Aquitaine to John. Richard refused absolutely. Eleanor supported Richard from her prison. The family's hatreds were tearing Henry's empire apart. In 1189, Henry faced his final rebellion. Richard allied with Philip Augustus of France against his own father. Henry's supporters abandoned him one by one. Old friends joined his enemies for better terms. Even his illegitimate son Geoffrey turned against him. Henry was forced to make peace on his enemies' terms. The peace treaty at Azay-le-Ferron humiliated Henry completely. He had to acknowledge Richard as his heir officially. He had to pay massive compensation to Philip Augustus. Worst of all, he had to forgive all the nobles who had betrayed him. When Henry saw John's name on the list of traitors, he turned his face to the wall and never spoke again. Henry II died at Chinon Castle on July 6, 1189. He was 56 years old and had ruled for 35 years. Servants stole his clothes and jewellery while he lay dying. His body was left naked on the floor for hours. The great Plantagenet Empire passed to Richard, a man who cared nothing for England itself. Richard Plantagenet became King of England on July 6, 1189. He was 31 years old and obsessed with military glory. Within months, he began planning the Third Crusade to recapture Jerusalem from Saladin. He saw England as nothing more than a bank account to fund his holy war. This attitude would define his entire reign. The myth of Richard the Lionheart began during his own lifetime. Troubadours sang about his courage and chivalry across Europe. They claimed he fought lions with his bare hands. They said his sword could cut through iron armour like silk cloth. But the reality was far more complex and often ugly. Richard's first act as king was selling everything he could for crusade money. He put royal offices up for auction to the highest bidders. He sold charters, privileges, and pardons for cash. He even joked that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. England became a commodity to be stripped for Richard's personal glory. The preparations for crusade revealed Richard's true priorities. He spent months organising his army and fleet. He negotiated detailed contracts with Italian merchants for supplies. He planned his route through France and the Mediterranean carefully, but he spent only 4 months in England during his entire 10-year reign. He couldn't even speak English fluently. Richard's marriage to Berengaria of Navarre was purely political. He needed her father's support for his crusade. The wedding took place in Cyprus during Richard's journey to the Holy Land. Berengaria never visited England as queen. She probably never learned more than a few words of English. Their marriage produced no children and little affection. But Richard's military genius was undeniable. At the Siege of Acre in 1191, he earned his Lionheart nickname through spectacular bravery. When a crossbow bolt struck him in the shoulder, he kept fighting until the city surrendered. He personally led cavalry charges that broke Muslim battle lines repeatedly. His tactical skills were legendary among friends and enemies alike. The relationship with his brother John during Richard's absence was catastrophic for England. Richard made John swear not to enter England for 3 years, but John broke this oath immediately. He began building his own power base while Richard fought in the Holy Land. John claimed Richard would never return alive from the Crusades. John's conspiracy with Philip Augustus of France nearly succeeded completely. Philip had returned early from the crusade and began invading Richard's French territories. John promised to help Philip if he supported John's claim to the English throne. Together they captured several important castles in Normandy. England faced civil war and foreign invasion simultaneously. Then disaster struck Richard personally. On his return journey from the Holy Land in 1192, shipwreck forced him to travel overland through Austria. Duke Leopold of Austria captured him and demanded a massive ransom. Leopold sold Richard to Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI for even more money. The King of England became a valuable prisoner. The ransom demand shocked medieval Europe. Emperor Henry VI wanted 150,000 marks of silver for Richard's freedom. This was approximately 3 years' total income from England. Every person in the kingdom would have to pay special taxes. Churches would melt down their silver ornaments. Noble families would sell ancestral lands to raise money. The story of the Blackwood family from Yorkshire shows how Richard's ransom destroyed ordinary people's lives. Thomas Blackwood owned 60 acres of good farmland. His family had worked this land for 4 generations. When royal tax collectors arrived, Thomas couldn't pay his share of the ransom demand. He was forced to sell half his land to the local abbey. Thomas's wife, Margaret, took their 2 youngest children to work as servants in the abbey kitchen. Their eldest son, Peter, joined a group of bandits in Sherwood Forest because he couldn't find honest work. The family's comfortable life collapsed overnight because their king valued personal glory more than his subjects' welfare. The Robin Hood legends that emerged during Richard's reign reflected real social tensions. Sherwood Forest was full of displaced peasants who couldn't pay their taxes. Former soldiers returned from crusade to find their homes sold for debt. These men turned to banditry naturally. They claimed to serve the true King Richard against false Prince John. But the real Robin Hood stories were far darker than modern versions suggest. Medieval outlaws rarely helped the poor. They robbed travellers and merchants for their own survival. They kidnapped wealthy people for ransom money. Some became little better than terrorists who attacked royal officials randomly. The forest outlaws were symptoms of Richard's failed kingship. When Richard finally returned to England in 1194, he stayed only 2 months. He needed to raise more money for his war against Philip Augustus in France. English taxpayers had to fund yet another military campaign. Richard treated England like a conquered territory that existed to serve his ambitions. He showed no gratitude for the incredible sacrifices his subjects had made. Richard's final campaign in France revealed both his military brilliance and his ultimate failure as a king. He built the mighty fortress of Château Gaillard to guard Normandy from French attack. This castle was considered impregnable by medieval standards. It cost more than England's annual royal income to construct. But Richard never lived to see if his masterpiece could protect his lands. On March 25, 1199, Richard was besieging the small castle of Charlus-Chabrol in southern France. The garrison had found a treasure of Roman gold coins. Richard demanded the treasure as his feudal right. The defenders refused and prepared for siege. It was a petty quarrel over money that would cost Richard his life. During the siege, Richard walked too close to the castle walls without proper armour. A crossbow bolt fired by a defender named Pierre Basile struck Richard in the shoulder. The wound seemed minor initially. Medieval surgery was primitive, but many soldiers survived similar injuries. Richard expected to recover within a few weeks, but gangrene set in within days. The wound began to stink and turn black around the edges. Richard's fever spiked dangerously high. He became delirious and called for his mother Eleanor repeatedly. The greatest warrior of his generation was dying from a minor wound inflicted by an unknown French peasant. The irony was perfect and terrible. Richard died on April 6, 1199, at the age of 41. He had ruled England for 10 years, but spent less than 10 months in the kingdom. His last act was forgiving Pierre Basile, the man who shot him. But Richard's followers ignored this mercy. They flayed Basile alive after Richard's death. Even Richard's final gesture of chivalry was perverted by his supporters' cruelty. The great Crusader king's death left England in chaos. Richard had no legitimate children. His designated heir was his youngest brother John, but many nobles supported Arthur of Brittany, who was Geoffrey's son and Richard's nephew. Arthur had a better genealogical claim to the throne. Another succession crisis seemed inevitable. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now 77 years old, acted quickly to secure John's coronation. She understood that England needed strong leadership immediately. Philip Augustus was already invading Normandy. Welsh princes were raiding English border territories. Scotland's king was gathering armies for possible invasion. Eleanor's political experience saved the Plantagenet dynasty from collapse. But John Lackland was everything Richard wasn't. Where Richard was brave, John was cowardly. Where Richard was generous to followers, John was suspicious and cruel. Where Richard inspired loyalty through personal charisma, John created enemies through petty vindictiveness. The worst Plantagenet's son was about to become King of England. John Plantagenet was crowned King of England on May 27, 1199. He was 32 years old and had waited his entire life for this moment. But John's reign began with military disaster. Philip Augustus of France immediately invaded Normandy. Arthur of Brittany raised rebellion in the Loire Valley. The Plantagenet Empire was crumbling before John could consolidate his power. Within 5 years, John had lost Normandy completely. This was the Plantagenet family's ancestral homeland. Every English king since William the Conqueror had ruled there. French armies captured Rouen, Caen, and Bayeux in rapid succession. John retreated to England in humiliation. He was mocked as John Softsword throughout Europe. The loss of Normandy changed English identity forever. Noble families had owned lands on both sides of the English Channel for 140 years. Now they had to choose between England and France. Most chose England reluctantly. They began thinking of themselves as English rather than Norman for the first time since the conquest. But John's worst crime happened in 1203. His nephew Arthur of Brittany was captured while besieging John's supporters at Mirebeau. Arthur was 16 years old and had a strong claim to the English throne. John ordered his nephew's murder personally. According to one chronicler, John killed Arthur with his own hands and threw the body into the River Seine. Arthur's murder horrified medieval opinion. Killing family members for political reasons was considered especially evil. The Church taught that kinship created sacred bonds that even kings couldn't break. John's reputation never recovered from this act. Even his supporters began questioning his fitness to rule. John's personal life was equally scandalous. His first marriage to Isabel of Gloucester was annulled because they were too closely related. In 1200, he married Isabella of Angoulême, who was already engaged to Hugh de Lusignan. This insult provoked the powerful Lusignan family to rebel. They appealed to Philip Augustus for support, giving France legal justification for invading John's territories. Isabella was 12 years old when John married her. He was 33. Even by medieval standards, this age gap raised eyebrows. Gossips claimed John was obsessed with his young wife sexually. They said he refused to attend important political meetings because he couldn't leave Isabella's bedroom. Whether true or not, these rumours damaged John's reputation as a serious king. John's financial demands grew increasingly desperate as his military failures mounted. He needed money to hire mercenaries and build new castles. English taxpayers faced assessment after assessment. The royal tax collectors became the most hated men in England. They seized property from families who couldn't pay immediately. They imprisoned debtors until their relatives raised ransom money. The story of Sir Robert Fitzwalter shows how John's tyranny destroyed even powerful noble families. Fitzwalter was one of the greatest barons in England. His family had supported the Plantagenets for generations. But John coveted Fitzwalter's daughter Matilda for his own pleasure. When Fitzwalter refused to hand over his daughter, John destroyed him completely. John accused Fitzwalter of treason without evidence. He confiscated all Fitzwalter's lands and castles. Fitzwalter fled to France as a penniless exile. His wife and children were imprisoned in different castles across England. John's persecution of the Fitzwalter family convinced other barons that no one was safe from royal tyranny. By 1214, John faced opposition from every direction. He had quarrelled with Pope Innocent III over church appointments. England was under papal interdict. meaning no religious services could be performed. French armies occupied most of John's continental territories. Welsh and Scottish princes raided English border regions constantly. Even John's own barons were plotting rebellion. The Barons' War began in earnest after John's defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in July 1214. John had assembled a great coalition against Philip Augustus. German, Flemish, and English armies were supposed to crush France between them. Instead, Philip won a decisive victory that ended John's hopes of recovering his lost territories. The rebel barons called themselves the Army of God and Holy Church. They claimed to fight for traditional English liberties against John's innovations. Their leader was Robert Fitzwalter, who had returned from exile. The rebels captured London in May 1215. John's supporters abandoned him one by one. The king faced complete defeat unless he negotiated. The meeting at Runnymede on June 15, 1215, was supposed to be a simple peace conference. John expected to make a few minor concessions and buy time to rebuild his forces. The barons had prepared a much more radical document. They demanded fundamental changes to how English kings could exercise power. This document would become known as Magna Carta. Magna Carta wasn't about democracy or individual rights as we understand them today. It was designed to protect the feudal privileges of wealthy barons. But some clauses had broader implications. The king couldn't imprison nobles without trial by their peers. He couldn't impose new taxes without consulting the kingdom's great council. These principles would expand over time to include more people. The most famous clause promised that justice would not be sold, denied, or delayed to anyone. This sounds like a universal right to fair treatment. But medieval justice was actually for sale regularly. Kings and lords charged fees for hearing legal cases. Poor people often couldn't afford access to courts at all. Magna Carta was trying to limit judicial corruption, not create equal justice. John signed Magna Carta under protest. He had no choice with rebel armies surrounding him, but he began planning his revenge immediately. Within months, he had persuaded Pope Innocent III to annul the agreement. The Pope declared that Magna Carta was illegal because it was extracted by force. Civil war resumed with even greater bitterness than before. The renewed fighting was brutal beyond medieval norms. John hired foreign mercenaries who showed no mercy to English opponents. They burned churches and monasteries that supported the rebels. They tortured prisoners for information about rebel plans. Even chronicles written by John's supporters admit his forces committed terrible atrocities. French intervention changed everything in 1216. The rebel barons invited Prince Louis of France to become King of England. This was an extraordinary step that revealed their desperation. English nobles were asking a foreign prince to conquer their own country. Louis landed with a large army and captured much of southeastern England. John's sudden death on October 19, 1216, probably saved the Plantagenet dynasty. He died of dysentery at Newark Castle while trying to suppress rebel strongholds in the north. His supporters later claimed he was poisoned by a monk at Swineshead Abbey. Whether he was murdered or died naturally, John's death allowed a new settlement of England's political crisis. John left behind a 9-year-old son named Henry III. Child kings were vulnerable, but also less threatening than adult rulers. The barons who had rebelled against John's tyranny were willing to accept a boy they could control. The great magnate William Marshal became regent for young Henry. This choice showed that England's political system was still fundamentally stable despite recent chaos. The reissue of Magna Carta in 1217 established its permanent importance. Henry III's government used the charter to legitimize the new reign. They promised to govern according to law rather than royal will. Magna Carta became a symbol of limited monarchy that would inspire future generations of English political thinkers. But the immediate impact was more practical. Henry III's minority government needed baron support desperately. Foreign armies occupied English soil. The royal treasury was empty. Scotland threatened invasion from the north. Magna Carta was a peace treaty that allowed England to survive its worst political crisis since 1066. The principles of limited royal power would prove remarkably durable over the following centuries. Young Edward Plantagenet was only 15 years old when civil war nearly destroyed his family's throne. The year was 1264, and his father Henry III faced the most serious baronial rebellion since King John's time. Simon de Montfort had captured the king and controlled the government. Edward was a prisoner in his own palace. He watched helplessly as his father's enemies carved up the royal estates among themselves. The trauma of those months shaped Edward's entire worldview. He saw how weakness invited attack. He learned that mercy was often mistaken for cowardice. Most importantly, he understood that kings must inspire fear to maintain respect. The gentle, artistic nature he inherited from his father died during his captivity. A cold, calculating warrior emerged instead. Edward's escape from Simon de Montfort's custody became the stuff of legend. On May 28, 1265, he asked permission to exercise his horses outside Hereford. His guards agreed, thinking this was harmless recreation, but Edward had secretly arranged for fresh horses to be waiting nearby. When his own mount was exhausted, he mounted a swift destrier and galloped to freedom. It was his first taste of the cunning that would make him famous. The Battle of Evesham on August 4, 1265, was Edward's real baptism in warfare. He commanded the cavalry charge that shattered the rebel army. Simon de Montfort died in the fighting, his body hacked to pieces by Edward's knights. The prince ordered de Montfort's head and testicles sent to Lady Mortimer as a gruesome gift. This casual cruelty shocked even hardened medieval warriors. But Edward's most transformative experience was his marriage to Eleanor of Castile in 1254. He was 15, she was 13. Most royal marriages were loveless political arrangements. Edward and Eleanor were different. They became genuinely devoted to each other. Eleanor would accompany Edward on crusade, bear him 16 children, and remain his closest advisor for 36 years. Eleanor's influence on Edward was extraordinary. She was intelligent, cultured, and surprisingly strong-willed. She could read Latin, French, and Castilian fluently. She managed Edward's financial affairs with remarkable skill. But most importantly, she softened his brutal edges without weakening his determination. Eleanor was the only person who could calm Edward's legendary temper tantrums. Edward's physical appearance made him unforgettable. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. His long legs earned him the nickname Longshanks. His hair was golden blonde in youth but turned white early. He had piercing blue eyes that could terrify courtiers with a single glance. His voice was surprisingly high-pitched for such a large man. The new king's eating habits revealed his restless energy. Edward consumed enormous quantities of food at irregular hours. He would eat nothing all day, then devour an entire roasted pig at midnight. He preferred simple foods like bread, cheese, and ale to elaborate court dishes. His cooks complained that he never sat still long enough for formal meals. Edward often ate while walking or riding his horse, but Edward's famous temper was his most feared characteristic. When angry, he would tear his clothes, break furniture, and scream at servants. Courtiers learned to recognize the warning signs. Edward's left eyelid would twitch when he was becoming furious. Smart men made excuses to leave the room immediately. Those who stayed often faced physical violence or permanent exile from court. Edward's first major policy decision shocked medieval Europe. In 1290 he expelled all Jews from England. This wasn't unusual by medieval standards. France had expelled its Jews in 1182, but Edward's expulsion was particularly systematic and cruel. Jewish families had to leave within 3 months. They could take only what they could carry personally. Their houses, businesses, and debts remained behind for Christian neighbours to claim. The human cost of the Jewish expulsion was enormous. England's Jewish community had lived there for over 2 centuries. They had built synagogues, schools, and cemeteries. Their children spoke English as their first language. Suddenly, 16,000 people became refugees overnight. Many elderly Jews died during the crossing to France. Families were separated permanently when storms scattered their ships. But Edward's motives weren't purely religious. He owed Jewish moneylenders enormous sums from his crusade expenses. Expelling them cancelled these debts immediately. He also confiscated all Jewish property for the royal treasury. The expulsion raised enough money to fund Edward's planned conquest of Wales. Medieval economics and religious hatred worked hand in hand. Edward's castle-building programme in Wales was the largest construction project in medieval Europe. Between 1277 and 1287, he built 8 massive fortresses. Flint, Rhuddlan, Builth, Aberystwyth, Conway, Caernarfon, Harlech and Beaumaris formed an iron ring around Welsh territory. Each castle cost more than the annual income of most English earls. Together they represented Edward's determination to crush Welsh independence forever. These weren't just military fortifications. They were symbols of permanent English occupation. Each castle anchored a new English town planted in conquered Welsh territory. English merchants received trading privileges that excluded Welsh competitors. English law replaced traditional Welsh customs. The castles announced that the old Wales was dead and would never return. The architectural details revealed Edward's psychological warfare strategy. Caernarfon Castle was built to resemble the walls of Constantinople. This connected Edward's conquest to the Roman Empire's glory days. Conway Castle's 8 massive towers could be seen for miles across the Welsh mountains. Every Welsh family was reminded daily of English power. The castles were designed to break Welsh spirits as much as Welsh armies. Master James of St. George designed most of Edward's Welsh castles. He was the greatest military architect of his age. His innovations included concentric defences, arrow loops positioned for maximum killing efficiency, and sally ports for surprise counterattacks. But James also understood architecture's propaganda value. His castles were beautiful as well as deadly. They made English power seem inevitable and eternal. The cost of Edward's castle programme nearly bankrupted England. Parliament granted extraordinary taxes to fund the construction. English peasants paid heavy assessments for years. Italian bankers loaned enormous sums at high interest rates. By 1290, the royal debt equalled 5 years of normal royal income. Edward's architectural monuments to conquest created financial problems that would plague his successors. But Edward's Welsh policy worked exactly as planned. The independent Welsh principalities collapsed within a decade. Welsh noble families either fled to exile or submitted to English rule. The ancient laws of Hywel Dda were replaced by English common law. Welsh poetry and music survived, but Welsh political independence was finished. Edward had created the template for later English imperial expansion. Personal stories reveal how conquest affected ordinary Welsh families. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn owned a small farm near Caernarfon. His family had worked the same land for 8 generations. When Edward's armies arrived, Gruffydd's eldest son died fighting at the Battle of Orwyn Bridge. His farmland was confiscated for the new English castle. Gruffydd's surviving children became labourers, building the fortress that symbolised their family's defeat. Eleanor of Castile supported Edward's Welsh conquests enthusiastically. She accompanied him on several military campaigns. She gave birth to their son Alfonso at Bayonne while returning from Gascony. But Eleanor also tried to moderate Edward's harshest policies. She interceded for Welsh prisoners and helped arrange ransoms for captured nobles. Eleanor's influence prevented even greater brutality during the conquest. The Queen's business activities in conquered Wales were controversial but legal by medieval standards. Eleanor purchased lands from desperate Welsh nobles at far below market value. She established markets in English towns that competed with traditional Welsh trading centres. Critics accused her of profiteering from conquest. Eleanor defended herself by pointing out that her investments brought economic development to backward regions. But Edward's happiness with Eleanor couldn't last forever. She had already borne 15 children by 1290. Each pregnancy was more dangerous than the last. Medieval medicine offered no reliable contraception or safe childbirth procedures. Eleanor knew that every pregnancy might kill her. But royal wives were expected to produce heirs regardless of personal cost. Her final pregnancy would prove fatal. Llywelyn ap Gruffydd called himself Prince of Wales and meant it seriously. In 1277, he controlled most of Wales independently from English rule. His grandfather had signed treaties with King John recognising Welsh autonomy. Llywelyn believed he ruled a sovereign nation, not an English province. This fundamental disagreement would destroy both him and independent Wales. Edward had very different ideas about Wales' political status. He considered Llywelyn a rebellious English vassal, not an independent prince. When Llywelyn refused to attend Edward's coronation in 1274, the English king began planning military conquest. Edward believed that Britain could have only one ruler. Regional independence was intolerable to his vision of unified royal authority. The First Welsh War began in 1277 when Llywelyn refused to pay homage to Edward personally. English armies invaded from 3 directions simultaneously. Edward commanded the main force along the North Welsh coast. The Earl of Lancaster attacked through mid-Wales. Forces from English border castles raided South Wales constantly. Llywelyn found himself surrounded and outnumbered catastrophically. But Edward's real weapon was economic warfare rather than military conquest. English forces captured Anglesey, which produced most of Wales' grain supply. They burned the harvest before Llywelyn's forces could collect it. Welsh armies began starving within months. Llywelyn was forced to surrender before winter arrived. The first conquest seemed almost effortless from Edward's perspective. The Treaty of Aberconwy in November 1277 reduced Llywelyn from independent prince to English vassal. He kept the title Prince of Wales, but only over a tiny territory around Snowdonia. His brothers received independent lordships that divided Welsh unity. Most importantly, Llywelyn had to pay homage to Edward publicly. This ceremony humiliated the Welsh prince before his own people. But Llywelyn's final rebellion began over a personal grievance, not political principle. His brother Dafydd had submitted to English rule and received lands in return. In 1282, Dafydd suddenly attacked English castles without warning. He claimed Edward's officials were oppressing Welsh families systematically. Dafydd's rebellion forced Llywelyn to choose between supporting his brother or maintaining his uncomfortable peace with England. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Orwyn Bridge on December 11, 1282. Llywelyn was trying to rally support in mid-Wales when English forces cornered his small army. The battle was brief and one-sided. Llywelyn died early in the fighting, killed by an English spearman who didn't recognise him initially. The last Prince of Wales died almost anonymously in a minor skirmish. Edward's treatment of Llywelyn's head showed his understanding of medieval psychological warfare. He ordered the head displayed at the Tower of London crowned with ivy mockingly. This perverted the ancient Welsh tradition of crowning bards with ivy wreaths. The gesture told Welsh people that their cultural traditions were now subjects for English amusement. It was a masterpiece of symbolic humiliation, but personal tragedy struck Edward just as his Welsh triumph reached completion. Eleanor of Castile died at Harby in Lincolnshire on November 28, 1290. She was returning from a pilgrimage to Scotland when fever overcame her suddenly. Edward was campaigning in Wales when messengers brought the devastating news. The king who had conquered nations was helpless against his wife's illness. Edward's grief over Eleanor's death surprised everyone who knew him. This man who showed no mercy to enemies wept openly at his wife's funeral. He ordered her body embalmed so he could accompany it slowly back to London. The funeral procession took 12 days to reach Westminster Abbey. Edward stopped the cortege at every town to hold memorial services for Eleanor. The Eleanor crosses became Edward's most personal monuments. He ordered elaborate stone crosses erected at every place where Eleanor's funeral procession rested overnight. Geddington, Hardingstone, Waltham, and 9 other locations received these beautiful Gothic monuments. Each cross was carved with Eleanor's image and heraldic symbols. They were love letters written in stone by a grieving husband. Only 3 Eleanor crosses survive today, but medieval chroniclers described them as breathtakingly beautiful. The crosses at Cheapside and Charing in London were particularly elaborate. Master craftsmen from across Europe worked on the sculptures and architectural details. No expense was spared in creating these monuments to royal love. Edward spent more on Eleanor's crosses than most kings spent on entire castles. The human impact of Edward's Welsh conquest was devastating for ordinary families. Meredith ap Rhys had been a minor Welsh lord with estates near Carmarthen. His family traced their lineage back to the legendary King Arthur. After Llywelyn's defeat, English administrators confiscated most of Meredith's lands. His eldest son died fighting at Orwyn Bridge. His surviving children became servants in their own ancestral hall. But some Welsh families adapted successfully to English rule. Gruffydd ap Gwenwyn had supported Edward during the conquest. He received English titles and additional lands as rewards. His children learned to speak French and adopted English customs. Within a generation they were virtually indistinguishable from Anglo-Norman nobles. Collaboration offered survival for those willing to abandon Welsh identity. The birth of Edward's son at Caernarfon Castle in 1284 was carefully planned political theatre. Edward announced that Wales now had a prince who spoke no English and whose first word was Welsh. This was technically true since newborn babies don't speak any language, but the symbolism was clear. The future Edward the Sioux would be the first Prince of Wales born on Welsh soil. English rule was becoming hereditary and permanent. The ceremony investing baby Edward as Prince of Wales created a new constitutional tradition. No previous English prince had held this specific title. Edward I was inventing a new form of royal authority that combined conquest with dynastic legitimacy. Future English heirs would automatically become princes of Wales, linking the English succession to Welsh subordination permanently. Welsh resistance didn't end with Llywelyn's death. Dafydd ap Gruffydd continued fighting until his capture in June 1283. Edward ordered him executed by hanging, drawing and quartering. This was the traditional punishment for treason, but it had rarely been applied to royal prisoners before. Dafydd became the first prince in British history to suffer this humiliating death. His execution announced that royal blood offered no protection from English justice. The last Welsh rebellion occurred in 1294-1295 under Madog ap Llywelyn. He claimed to be the rightful Prince of Wales and gathered significant support across the country. English settlements were burned and English officials murdered. For several months it seemed possible that Welsh independence might be restored through popular uprising, but Edward's response to Madog's rebellion was swift and brutal. He led the largest army of his reign into Wales personally. English forces systematically destroyed rebel strongholds and executed captured leaders. Madog was taken prisoner and disappeared into English custody. His fate remains unknown, but he was certainly never seen alive again. The conquest's impact on Welsh culture was more gradual but equally devastating. English became the language of government, law and commerce. Welsh remained the language of peasants and shepherds. Welsh legal traditions were replaced by English common law. The ancient Welsh law codes that had governed for centuries became historical curiosities. An entire civilization was slowly strangled by administrative efficiency. Church organisation also changed dramatically after conquest. Edward replaced Welsh bishops with English appointees whenever possible. Monasteries that had preserved Welsh manuscripts for centuries came under English control. Religious services began incorporating prayers for English royal victory. The church became another instrument of cultural assimilation rather than Welsh resistance. But some aspects of Welsh culture proved remarkably resilient. Welsh poetry and music continued flourishing despite political conquest. The Eisteddfod tradition of competitive performance survived and even expanded. Welsh genealogies preserved family histories and national memories. Cultural identity persisted even when political independence was impossible. This cultural survival would eventually fuel future Welsh nationalist movements. Edward's Welsh castles required permanent English garrisons to maintain control. These soldiers married Welsh women and learned Welsh customs. Their children grew up bilingual and bicultural. Over time, the distinction between conqueror and conquered began blurring in border regions. Cultural mixing created new identities that were neither purely English nor purely Welsh. The economic transformation of Wales was equally dramatic. English merchants established trading networks that bypassed traditional Welsh markets. New English towns received royal charters that granted commercial privileges. Welsh craftsmen found themselves excluded from the most profitable trades. The conquest created an economic hierarchy that placed English interests above Welsh needs systematically. But resistance took new forms as military rebellion became impossible. Welsh poets composed coded verses celebrating ancient heroes and lamenting current oppression. Religious figures preached sermons that emphasized biblical stories of liberation. Even Welsh place names became acts of cultural defiance that preserved ancient memories in everyday speech. King Alexander III of Scotland died in the most ordinary way possible. On March 19, 1286, he was riding home from a council meeting in Edinburgh. A storm arose as he approached Kinghorn. His horse stumbled on the rocky path and threw him over a cliff. Scotland's last strong king broke his neck in a simple riding accident. This prosaic death would trigger decades of warfare. Alexander left only one direct heir, his granddaughter Margaret, called the Maid of Norway. She was 3 years old and living in Norway with her father, King Eric. A child queen ruling from a foreign country seemed impossible to most Scots. The Scottish nobility began considering alternative claimants immediately. Edward the Eye watched these developments with keen interest from across the border. Edward proposed that young Margaret marry his son, the future Edward II. This would unite the English and Scottish crowns peacefully through marriage. The Treaty of Bergen in 1290 arranged this marriage while supposedly preserving Scottish independence. But many Scots suspected Edward planned to absorb Scotland just as he had absorbed Wales. Their suspicions proved entirely correct. Then Margaret died suddenly in the Orkney Islands while travelling to Scotland in September 1290. She was only 7 years old. Her death ended the direct royal line and created a succession crisis that would destroy Scottish independence. Multiple claimants emerged with plausible genealogical arguments. Civil war seemed inevitable unless someone imposed a solution. The Scottish nobles made their fatal mistake by asking Edward a friend to arbitrate between rival claimants. They believed his reputation for legal expertise would ensure a fair decision. They also thought his involvement would prevent civil war by giving legitimacy to the chosen heir. But Edward saw this invitation as an opportunity to establish English overlordship over Scotland permanently. John Balliol had the strongest genealogical claim to the Scottish throne. His great-great-grandfather had been younger brother to William the Lion. Robert Bruce's claim was weaker, but his supporters were more numerous. Both men were powerful Anglo-Norman lords with estates in England as well as Scotland. Edward could manipulate either one through their English properties. Edward's decision in favour of John Balliol came with unacceptable conditions. The new Scottish king had to acknowledge Edward as his feudal overlord. He had to do homage for Scotland just as English earls did homage for their estates. This reduced Scotland from an independent kingdom to an English fief. The Scots had gained a king but lost their sovereignty. John Balliol's reign was doomed from the beginning. His Scottish subjects called him Toom ta Bard, empty coat, because they believed he was Edward's puppet. When Edward demanded Scottish military service for his wars in France, Scottish nobles refused absolutely. They forced Balliol to renounce his homage to Edward and ally with France instead. The old alliance between Scotland and France began as anti-English resistance. Edward's invasion of Scotland in 1296 was swift and merciless. English armies captured Berwick and slaughtered thousands of civilians. The massacre at Berwick was so brutal that chroniclers compared it to biblical destruction of cities. Edward ordered every man, woman and child killed to terrorise other Scottish towns into submission. His brutality worked perfectly in the short term. The Battle of Dunbar on April 27, 1296, broke Scottish military resistance completely. The Scottish army fled after only token fighting. John Balliol surrendered and was stripped of his royal insignia publicly. Edward carried the Stone of Destiny back to Westminster Abbey as a trophy. Scotland's ancient coronation stone would remain in England for 7 centuries, but Scottish resistance revived under unexpected leadership. William Wallace was a younger son of a minor noble family from Renfrewshire. He had no claim to high command by feudal standards, but Wallace possessed something most Scottish nobles lacked: genuine hatred of English rule. He refused to accept that Scotland's independence was finished permanently. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge on September 11, 1297, shocked medieval Europe. His force of common soldiers destroyed an English army led by experienced knights. The battle proved that superior tactics could overcome feudal military hierarchy. Wallace used the narrow bridge to neutralise English cavalry advantages. Scottish spearmen slaughtered English knights trapped in marshy ground. The psychological impact of Stirling Bridge was even more important than its military consequences. Scots realised that English armies weren't invincible after all. Wallace became a national hero overnight. But his success also marked him for Edward's personal vengeance. The English king would never forgive being humiliated by a minor Scottish knight. Robert the Bruce's relationship with Edward was far more complex than simple, patriotic resistance. Bruce was an Anglo-Norman lord who owned extensive estates in England. His family had supported Edward's claim to overlordship initially, but Bruce also had his own claim to the Scottish throne that was arguably stronger than John Balliol's. Personal ambition and national feeling were hopelessly entangled in Bruce's motivations. Bruce's murder of John Comyn at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries on February 10, 1306, was either heroic or criminal depending on one's perspective. Comyn was Bruce's main rival for the Scottish throne. Some sources claim they were negotiating when Bruce suddenly stabbed Comyn. Others suggest Comyn was planning to betray Bruce to the English. Either way, Bruce had committed sacrilege by killing someone in a church. The human cost of constant warfare devastated families along the Anglo-Scottish border. The Armstrong family owned lands near Carlisle that were raided repeatedly by both sides. Thomas Armstrong lost 3 sons in various battles between 1296 and 1314. His farmland was burned so often that grass wouldn't grow on it. His wife Ellen died of starvation during a particularly harsh winter, when no supplies could reach their isolated farm. Border families developed their own survival strategies that ignored royal allegiances. They formed family alliances that crossed national boundaries. They learned to hide livestock and grain from raiding armies. Some families became professional raiders themselves, attacking both English and Scottish neighbours indiscriminately. The border regions became a lawless zone where only the strongest survived. Edward's final Scottish campaign began when he was 68 years old and clearly dying. His doctors advised against the journey north, but Edward refused to abandon his life's work of uniting Britain. He travelled by litter because he was too weak to ride a horse, but his determination to crush Scottish independence remained as strong as ever. On July 7, 1307, Edward I died at Berg by Sands, just a few miles from the Scottish border. His last words allegedly were instructions to boil his flesh from his bones so that his skeleton could be carried into battle against the Scots. This macabre final request revealed Edward's obsession with completing Scotland's conquest. He died believing that English unity required Scottish submission. But Edward's death gave Robert the Bruce the breathing space he needed desperately. The new English king, Edward II, was young, inexperienced, and more interested in his male favourites than Scottish warfare. Bruce used the next 7 years to build a guerrilla resistance network across Scotland. By 1314, only a few English strongholds remained in Scottish hands. The unfinished business Edward thus left to his son would define Anglo-Scottish relations for centuries. Bruce's eventual victory at Bannockburn in 1314 would establish Scottish independence permanently. But the wars Edward began would continue intermittently until 1707. His vision of British unity under English leadership was premature by 400 years. Edward thus had forged much of Britain through conquest, but his greatest conquest remained incomplete. Wales had been absorbed successfully into an English administrative system. Scotland had resisted absorption and maintained its separate identity. This difference would shape British politics for centuries to come. Edward's hammer had bent Scotland but never broken it completely. The personal relationships between medieval kings often determined the fate of entire nations. Edward's friendship with Eleanor of Castile had softened his harsh edges temporarily. His obsession with conquering Scotland had consumed the last decade of his life. His failure to defeat Robert the Bruce permanently damaged English prestige. Individual personalities shaped historical events just as much as economic or military factors. Edward II became King of England at age 23. He was tall, handsome and athletic like his father, but there the resemblance ended completely. Where Edward then had been ruthless and focused, Edward VI was gentle and easily distracted. Where his father had terrified enemies, Edward II preferred digging ditches and thatching roofs with common labourers. England had never had a king quite like him. The new king's first act shocked the entire court. He recalled Piers Gaveston from exile immediately. His father had banished Gaveston for being a bad influence on the young prince. Edward I believed Gaveston was corrupting his son morally and politically, but Edward II clearly didn't care about his father's opinions anymore. Gaveston returned to England within weeks of the old king's death. Piers Gaveston was everything Edward II wasn't. He was witty, sophisticated, and ruthlessly ambitious. Born in Gascony, he had come to England as a young knight seeking his fortune. His charm and intelligence impressed the royal court immediately, but Gaveston's relationship with Prince Edward raised eyebrows from the beginning. They spent hours together daily in private conversation. They exchanged expensive gifts and personal tokens constantly. Medieval people understood same-sex relationships very differently than we do today. The Church condemned sodomy as a deadly sin, but close male friendships were considered normal and even admirable. Knights were expected to form intense emotional bonds with their comrades. The problem with Edward and Gaveston wasn't their affection, but Gaveston's political influence over the king. Edward II made Gaveston Earl of Cornwall within months of becoming king. This was one of England's richest earldoms, traditionally reserved for royal family members. English nobles were outraged that a foreign upstart received such honours. They began plotting against Gaveston immediately, but Edward seemed oblivious to their growing anger and resentment. The king's marriage to Isabella of France in January 1308 was supposed to solve his political problems. Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV, one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. The alliance would strengthen England's position against Scottish rebels. Isabella was also beautiful, intelligent, and only 12 years old. Everyone expected Edward to fall in love with his new wife immediately, but Edward brought Piers Gaveston to his own wedding. Gaveston wore clothing more elaborate than the bride's dress. He sat at the high table while English earls were placed at lower tables. Worst of all, Edward spent more time talking to Gaveston than to Isabella during the feast. French observers reported that Edward seemed more interested in his favourite than his wife. This was a diplomatic disaster that insulted France and embarrassed England. Isabella of France would later be called the she-wolf for her ruthless pursuit of power. But in 1308 she was just a confused child trying to understand her strange new husband. Edward was kind to her but emotionally distant. He gave her expensive gifts but showed no romantic interest. Isabella quickly realised that Gaveston occupied the place in Edward's heart that should have belonged to her. The Earl of Lancaster's family shows how Edward's favouritism destroyed traditional noble relationships. Henry de Lacy had served Edward I faithfully for 40 years. His son Thomas expected to inherit his father's position as the king's chief adviser, but Edward VII ignored Thomas completely while lavishing attention on Gaveston. Thomas felt betrayed by the king he had sworn to serve loyally. Thomas de Lacy's resentment was shared by most English nobles. They had fought Edward III's wars and paid his taxes for decades. They expected his son to reward their loyalty with honours and influence. Instead, Edward II gave the best positions to Gaveston and other foreigners. The traditional relationship between king and nobility was breaking down completely. The Lords Ordainers formed in 1310 to limit Edward's power over government appointments. They demanded that Gaveston be exiled again permanently. They insisted that important decisions require baronial consent. Most importantly, they claimed the right to remove royal officials who governed badly. This was revolutionary thinking that challenged fundamental assumptions about royal authority. Edward VI's response to the Ordainers was typically weak and indecisive. He agreed to their demands publicly but continued supporting Gaveston privately. He allowed Gaveston to return from exile secretly. He gave his favourite new lands and titles under different names. Edward seemed to believe he could satisfy everyone through deception and compromise. He was catastrophically wrong. The breaking point came in 1312 when Gaveston was captured by the Earl of Warwick's forces. Warwick was known as the Black Dog of Arden for his fierce temper and violent methods. He had sworn to kill Gaveston if he ever returned from exile. When Gaveston fell into his hands, Warwick showed no mercy whatsoever. Piers Gaveston was murdered on June 19, 1312 at Blacklow Hill near Warwick. 2 Welshmen ran him through with their swords while Warwick's men held him down. His head was nearly severed from his body. The Earl of Lancaster watched the execution personally to ensure Gaveston was really dead. They left his body on the hillside for wild animals to devour. Edward II's grief over Gaveston's death was genuine and overwhelming. He wept openly at court for weeks. He refused to eat or conduct government business. He swore terrible vengeance against Gaveston's murderers, but Edward's threats were empty because he lacked his father's ruthless determination. The barons who killed Gaveston faced no serious punishment for their crime. The rise of Hugh Despenser the Younger filled the void left by Gaveston's death. Despenser was an English nobleman from an ancient family. His father had served Edward West loyally, but the younger Despenser was even more ambitious and greedy than Gaveston had been. He used his influence over Edward to accumulate vast estates and political power throughout England and Wales. Despenser's methods were more systematic than Gaveston's had been. He manipulated the legal system to steal lands from rival nobles. He used royal authority to cancel debts owed to his enemies. He placed his supporters in key government positions across England. Within a few years, Despenser controlled more territory than some medieval kings. His power corrupted him absolutely. The Despenser family's treatment of Lady Barrett shows their casual cruelty toward anyone who opposed them. Lady Elizabeth Barrett was a wealthy widow who owned valuable estates in Glamorgan. When she refused to sell her lands to Hugh Despenser at below-market prices, he simply took them by force. Lady Barrett was imprisoned in Cardiff Castle until she agreed to sign over her property. She died in captivity, broken by Despenser's greed. Queen Isabella watched these events with growing alarm. She realized that Despenser posed an even greater threat than Gaveston had. Where Gaveston had been content with personal luxury, Despenser wanted to control the entire kingdom. Isabella began corresponding secretly with French relatives and English exiles. She was preparing for war against her own husband's government. But Edward II remained completely under Despenser's influence. The king genuinely believed his favourite was protecting him from baronial plots. He couldn't see that Despenser's greed was destroying the loyalty Edward needed to survive as king. Every family that Despenser cheated became another enemy of the royal government. Edward was digging his own political grave. The War of St. Sardos in 1324 gave Isabella her opportunity to escape from England. Edward needed to negotiate with her brother, the King of France, about territorial disputes in Gascony. Isabella volunteered to serve as Edward's ambassador to the French court. She promised to arrange a peaceful settlement that would preserve English interests. Edward trusted his wife completely and allowed her to leave England with a small retinue. But Isabella had no intention of returning to England while the Despensers controlled her husband. Once she reached Paris, she began gathering support for an invasion of England. Her brother Charles IV provided money and military advisers. English exiles flocked to her banner. Most importantly, she began her famous affair with Roger Mortimer, the most dangerous enemy of Edward's regime. Roger Mortimer had escaped from the Tower of London in August 1323. He was one of England's most powerful barons before Edward II destroyed his family for opposing the Despensers. Mortimer's escape was carefully planned with inside help. He drugged his guards with wine mixed with opium. He used rope ladders to climb over the tower's walls. A boat waited to carry him across the Thames to safety. Mortimer's meeting with Isabella in Paris changed everything. He was 40 years old, experienced in warfare, and consumed with hatred for Edward II's government. Isabella was 30 years old, intelligent, beautiful, and desperate for revenge against the Despensers. Their affair combined personal passion with political necessity. Together they planned to conquer England and destroy Edward's regime completely. The invasion force that sailed from Dordrecht in September 1326 was surprisingly small. Isabella and Mortimer brought only 700 mercenaries with them. They landed at Orwell in Suffolk with barely enough money to pay their soldiers for a month. But they were counting on English support rather than military conquest. Their gamble would prove brilliantly successful. Edward II's government collapsed almost immediately after Isabella landed. Nobles who had suffered under Despenser rule joined the Queen's cause daily. Even royal officials began abandoning Edward when they realized which way the political wind was blowing. The king found himself virtually alone within weeks of his wife's invasion. Hugh Despenser the Elder surrendered at Bristol and was hanged immediately. He was nearly 80 years old and had served English kings faithfully for decades. But Isabella showed him no mercy because of his son's crimes. The old man was dragged through Bristol streets and executed before jeering crowds. His death announced that the Despenser family's power was finished forever. Edward II and Hugh Despenser the Younger fled toward Wales, hoping to find refuge there. but Welsh lords who had been oppressed by Despenser's policies refused to help them. The King of England was reduced to hiding in barns and forests like a common outlaw. His royal dignity meant nothing when he had no army to enforce his authority. The capture of Edward II and Hugh Despenser occurred at Neath Abbey on November 16, 1326. They had taken sanctuary in the monastery, hoping that religious law would protect them. But Isabella's forces surrounded the abbey and demanded the fugitives surrender. The abbot reluctantly handed over England's king and his hated favourite to their enemies. Hugh Despenser's execution at Hereford was deliberately designed to be as humiliating as possible. He was stripped naked and dragged through the streets tied to wild horses. Verses condemning his greed and tyranny were pinned to his body. He was hanged until nearly dead, then castrated and disemboweled while still alive. His screams could be heard throughout Hereford as he died in agony. But what to do with Edward II posed a more complex problem. Medieval law provided no precedent for removing an anointed king from power. The Church taught that kings ruled by divine right and could not be deposed by human authority. Isabella and Mortimer needed to find a way to eliminate Edward without appearing to commit regicide themselves. The forced abdication of January 20th, 1327 was carefully stage-managed to appear legal and voluntary. A delegation of bishops and nobles visited Edward at Kenilworth Castle. They told him that Parliament had declared him unfit to rule. They offered him a choice between abdication in favour of his son or complete forfeiture of the crown. Edward chose abdication to preserve the dynasty, but his tears revealed his true feelings. 14-year-old Edward III was crowned king immediately after his father's abdication. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents in the boy's name. They presented themselves as protectors of lawful monarchy rather than usurpers, but everyone understood that they had overthrown the legitimate king through military force. The precedent they established would haunt English politics for centuries. The murder of Edward II at Berkeley Castle remains one of medieval history's most controversial events. The former king died on September 21, 1327, while in the custody of Sir Thomas Berkeley and Sir John Maltravers. Official records claimed he died of natural illness, but contemporary rumours described a death far too convenient for Isabella and Mortimer's interests. The most famous account claims Edward was murdered with a red-hot iron poker inserted into his rectum. This story first appeared in chronicles written decades after the event. It may have been invented to reflect medieval opinions about Edward's sexual behaviour, but the manner of death, leaving no external wounds, would have suited murderers who wanted to conceal their crime. Other sources suggest Edward actually escaped from Berkeley Castle and lived for years as a hermit in Europe. A letter from Fieschi, an Italian priest, claimed to have met the former king at a monastery in Germany. Edward allegedly confessed his identity and described his escape in detail. Whether true or false, these stories show that many people refused to believe Edward had died naturally. The impact on young Edward III was profound and lasting. He was forced to watch his mother rule with her lover while his father died mysteriously in captivity. Edward III learned that royal authority depended on military strength rather than divine right. He also learned that personal relationships could be more dangerous than foreign enemies. These lessons would shape his entire approach to kingship. Isabella and Mortimer's regency became increasingly unpopular as years passed. They enriched themselves at the expense of the royal treasury. Mortimer accumulated titles and estates that made him richer than most kings. Isabella lived in luxury while ordinary people suffered from heavy taxation. Their relationship scandalized religious leaders who preached about proper marital behaviour. The Earl of Kent's execution in 1330 finally turned opinion completely against the regency. Edmund of Woodstock believed his half-brother Edward II was still alive and plotted to restore him. Mortimer used this as an excuse to eliminate a potential rival. But executing a member of the royal family for such a trivial offence shocked even Isabella's supporters. Edward III's coup against his mother and Mortimer occurred at Nottingham Castle in October 1330. The 18-year-old king entered the castle through a secret passage with a small group of supporters. They found Mortimer in Isabella's bedchamber and arrested him immediately. Isabella's screams of "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer" echoed through the castle corridors. Mortimer's trial and execution followed quickly. He was charged with murdering Edward II, though the evidence was circumstantial at best. Parliament condemned him as a traitor who had usurped royal authority. On November 29, 1330, Mortimer was hanged at Tyburn like a common criminal. His body was left on the gallows for 2 days as a warning to other would-be usurpers. Isabella's fate was more merciful but equally final. Edward III placed his mother under comfortable house arrest at Castle Rising in Norfolk. She received a generous pension but was forbidden to participate in politics. Isabella lived for 28 more years, watching from the sidelines as her son became one of England's greatest kings. She died in 1358, still wearing the hair shirt of a penitent. The revolution of 1326 to 1330 changed fundamental assumptions about royal marriage and power. Isabella had proved that queens could be as ruthless as kings when their interests were threatened. She had shown that personal relationships could override political loyalties. Most importantly, she had demonstrated that even anointed kings could be removed if they lost their subjects' support completely. Edward II's reign taught medieval England harsh lessons about the requirements of successful kingship. Military prowess was absolutely essential for royal authority. Kings who couldn't lead armies effectively lost respect and eventually lost their thrones. Edward's defeats by Robert the Bruce at Loudon Hill and Bannockburn destroyed his reputation permanently. Scottish independence became a symbol of English royal weakness. Personal relationships posed constant dangers for medieval monarchs. Edward's love for Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despencer created enemies who eventually destroyed him. Future kings would need to balance personal affections against political necessities. They would also need to choose advisors who strengthened rather than weakened royal authority. Edward's example showed how private feelings could have public consequences. The importance of managing noble relationships became crystal clear through Edward's failures. Medieval kings ruled through a complex web of personal loyalties and feudal obligations. When these relationships broke down, royal authority collapsed quickly. Edward alienated too many powerful families through favoritism and poor judgment. His son would need to rebuild these crucial connections from scratch. Parliament's role in deposing Edward II established important precedents for future constitutional development. The idea that kings could be removed for misgovernment was revolutionary in 1327. But once established, this principle would influence English political thinking for centuries. Future monarchs would need to consider parliamentary opinion more seriously than their predecessors had done. The Regency period also demonstrated the dangers of minority rule. When kings were too young to govern personally, ambitious adults could seize control of royal authority. Isabella and Mortimer's example would make future kings more suspicious of regents and guardians. It would also encourage child kings to assert personal rule as early as possible. Edward III was 18 years old when he seized control of his kingdom in 1330. He had spent 4 years watching his mother rule with her lover, while his father died mysteriously in captivity. These experiences taught him that royal authority came from strength, not birthright. He was determined to become everything his father wasn't: decisive, military, and absolutely in control. The young king's first priority was restoring English prestige after decades of humiliation. Scotland had maintained its independence under Robert the Bruce. France had supported his mother's invasion of England. Ireland was slipping away from English control. Edward inherited a kingdom that was weak, divided, and despised by its neighbours. He spent the rest of his 50-year reign reversing these failures. Edward's overthrow of Roger Mortimer sent a clear message about his intentions. The execution was swift, public, and merciless. But Edward showed calculated mercy to his mother Isabella. He could have executed her as a traitor, but chose comfortable imprisonment instead. This balance of ruthlessness and restraint became typical of Edward's political style throughout his reign. The creation of the Order of the Garter in 1348 revealed Edward's genius for medieval public relations. The order was supposedly founded when the Countess of Salisbury's garter fell during a court dance. Edward picked it up and tied it around his own leg, saying, "Honi soit qui mal y pense." Shame on him who thinks evil of it. Whether true or invented, this story became part of English royal legend. But the Order of the Garter served serious political purposes beyond romantic symbolism. Edward used it to bind his greatest nobles to the royal court through shared honour and chivalric ceremony. Members wore identical robes and attended regular feasts at Windsor Castle. Edward's marriage to Philippa of Hainault in 1328 was one of the most successful royal unions in English history. Philippa was intelligent, politically astute, and genuinely devoted to her husband and children. She bore Edward 12 children and managed the royal household with remarkable efficiency. More importantly, she helped Edward present a united royal family that contrasted sharply with his parents' disasters. Philippa practically invented the medieval ideal of English motherhood. She personally nursed wounded soldiers after battles. She interceded for prisoners and arranged ransoms for captured enemies. When 6 burghers of Calais were condemned to death, Philippa's tears moved Edward to spare their lives. Her combination of maternal compassion and political intelligence made her beloved throughout England. Court life at Windsor Castle under Edward III became legendary across Europe. The great round table Edward installed in the castle's hall was meant to evoke memories of King Arthur's court. Knights from across Christendom came to participate in Edward's tournaments and festivities. The royal court became a magnet for talent, culture, and military prowess that enhanced English prestige enormously. But Edward's most momentous decision was claiming the throne of France in 1337. His mother Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV of France. When her last surviving brother died without male heirs, Edward argued that he inherited the French crown through his mother. French lawyers claimed that women couldn't transmit royal rights. This legal dispute would trigger over a century of warfare. Edward's claim to France was legally dubious but politically brilliant. It gave him an excuse to attack France whenever English interests required it. It also transformed what would otherwise be territorial raids into a sacred dynastic quest. English soldiers fought more bravely when they believed they were recovering their king's rightful inheritance rather than simply conquering foreign territory. The development of English as a courtly language accelerated dramatically during Edward's reign. Previous kings had conducted business in French and Latin. Edward began using English for official proclamations and parliamentary proceedings. The Statute of Pleading in 1362 required law courts to use English rather than French. This linguistic revolution helped create English national identity. Geoffrey Chaucer's career illustrates how Edward's court encouraged English literary culture. Chaucer served as a diplomatic courier, customs official, and court poet during Edward's reign. His Canterbury Tales would become the greatest work of medieval English literature. But Chaucer was possible only because Edward's court valued English language culture for the first time since the Norman conquest. Edward's military reforms created the most effective army in medieval Europe. He combined heavy cavalry with longbow archers in new tactical formations. He used cannon at the Siege of Calais, making England one of the first countries to adopt gunpowder weapons systematically. Most importantly, he professionalized military service through regular pay and standardized equipment. The English longbow became Edward's signature weapon. It could penetrate armor at 200 yards and had a much faster rate of fire than crossbows. Edward recruited archers from Wales and northern England, regions with strong hunting traditions. These men could shoot 12 arrows per minute accurately. No other medieval army could match this firepower concentration, but Edward's success came at an enormous financial cost. His wars consumed far more money than normal royal revenues could provide. Parliament granted unprecedented taxes to fund military campaigns. Italian bankers loaned enormous sums at high interest rates. By the 1340s, England was the most heavily indebted kingdom in Europe. Edward's glory was purchased through crushing taxation. The impact on ordinary families was severe but bearable as long as victories continued. William Fletcher was a farmer in Kent whose 3 sons joined Edward's army. His eldest son died at Crecy, but the other 2 returned with enough loot to buy additional farmland. Military service offered social mobility for families willing to accept the risks. Success made sacrifice worthwhile. Edward's treatment of captured French nobles showed his understanding of medieval honour culture. He treated King John II of France as an honoured guest rather than a prisoner after the Battle of Poitiers. The French king lived in luxury in London and was allowed to return to France on parole. This chivalrous behaviour enhanced Edward's reputation among European nobility. The Battle of Crécy on August 26, 1346, changed medieval warfare forever. Edward III had invaded France with only 15,000 men. King Philip VI assembled 60,000 French soldiers to crush the English invaders. Every military expert expected French numerical superiority to win easily. They were catastrophically wrong about the power of English tactical innovation. Edward positioned his army on a hillside overlooking the village of Crécy. He divided his forces into 3 battles, each combining men-at-arms with longbow archers. The archers planted wooden stakes in front of their positions to stop cavalry charges. This defensive formation was designed to make French numerical superiority irrelevant by controlling the battlefield geometry. The French attack began with Genoese crossbowmen advancing up the slope. These were professional mercenaries with excellent equipment and extensive experience, but they had marched all day in heavy rain, and their bowstrings were wet. The English archers had kept their strings dry under their helmets. When the shooting began, English longbows outranged and outshot the Genoese crossbows completely. Philip VI ordered his knights to charge through the retreating Genoese. This created chaos as mounted men-at-arms trampled their own crossbowmen. The English archers shot into this confused mass of men and horses at point-blank range. French knights fell in heaps at the bottom of the slope. Their heavy armour became death traps rather than protection. The story of John de Vere, a 20-year-old archer from Essex, shows how ordinary English soldiers experienced this historic victory. John had never been in a major battle before Crécy. He shot 2 quivers of arrows during the French charges. He watched French knights die by the hundreds just yards from his position. John returned to England with French weapons and armour worth more than his father's annual income. But the most famous casualty at Crécy was John of Bohemia, the blind king who charged into battle tied to his horse. John was 50 years old and completely sightless, but he insisted on joining the attack to maintain his honour. His companions guided his horse toward the English lines, where he died fighting bravely but uselessly. His death became a symbol of outdated chivalric values meeting modern military reality. The Black Prince earned his legendary reputation at Crécy, though he was only 16 years old. Edward III deliberately gave his son command of one of the 3 battles to test his abilities under pressure. When the Black Prince's position was hard-pressed, his father refused to send reinforcements. "Let the boy win his spurs," was Edward's reported response. The prince held his ground and emerged from battle as England's greatest military hero. French losses at Crécy were staggering by medieval standards. Over 500 French nobles died, including many of the kingdom's most experienced military leaders. The English lost perhaps 200 men, mostly in hand-to-hand fighting after their arrows ran out. This casualty ratio was unprecedented in medieval warfare. It proved that tactical superiority could overcome massive numerical disadvantages. The siege of Calais that followed Crécy lasted 11 months. Edward III was determined to capture this crucial port city that controlled access to northern France. The French garrison under Jean de Vienne resisted heroically despite starvation and disease. When the city finally surrendered in August 1347, Edward initially ordered the entire population executed for their stubborn resistance. The famous story of the burghers of Calais shows how individual acts of courage could change royal policy. 6 leading citizens volunteered to die to save their fellow townspeople. They came before Edward wearing only shirts and carrying ropes around their necks. Queen Philippa's tearful intervention persuaded Edward to spare their lives. This incident became a symbol of merciful kingship tempering justice with compassion. But the real significance of Calais was strategic rather than symbolic. English control of this port gave them a permanent foothold in France. Calais became the base for future military campaigns and a crucial wool trading centre. English merchants could now ship goods directly to continental Europe without French interference. The capture of Calais was worth more than a dozen battlefield victories. The Battle of Poitiers on September 19, 1356 was even more spectacular than Crécy. The Black Prince commanded an English army of only 8,000 men that was being pursued by King John II of France with 35,000 soldiers. The English seemed trapped near Poitiers with no hope of escape. But the Black Prince chose to fight rather than surrender, and his tactical genius produced another miracle victory. The English position at Poitiers was naturally strong but not impregnable. They occupied a plateau south of the city with marshy ground protecting their flanks. The Black Prince arranged his archers and men-at-arms in the same formation that had worked at Crécy, but this time he kept a mounted reserve hidden behind the main battle line for a surprise counterattack. King John II of France had studied English tactics carefully since Crécy. He ordered his knights to fight on foot to avoid being shot down by archers. The French advance was more disciplined than at Crécy, and for a time it seemed they might break through English lines. But the Black Prince's hidden cavalry charge at the crucial moment turned French success into total disaster. The capture of King John II was the most dramatic moment of the battle. The French king fought courageously in the front ranks until overwhelmed by English soldiers. When he surrendered, John's first words were reportedly, "To whom shall I yield? Where is my cousin the Prince of Wales?" Even in defeat, he insisted on surrendering only to a social equal. Medieval honour culture survived even in military catastrophe. Thomas Dagworth, a Norfolk knight in the Black Prince's army, describes the aftermath of Poitiers in letters to his wife. He wrote about French nobles begging English soldiers to accept their ransoms. He described wagons full of gold, silver and jewellery being loaded for transport to England. Most remarkably, he noted that common English archers were making fortunes by capturing French aristocrats for ransom. The ransom of King John II became a major diplomatic and financial enterprise. The French agreed to pay 4 million gold écus for their king's freedom, approximately 6 times England's annual royal revenue. This enormous sum would fund English military operations for decades. But the psychological impact was even greater. England had captured the King of France himself and held him as a trophy. King John's captivity in London was comfortable but politically devastating for France. He lived in the Savoy Palace with a large household and was allowed to hunt and entertain visitors. But his absence left France without effective leadership during a crucial period. The Dauphin Charles struggled to maintain royal authority while his father enjoyed English hospitality as an honoured prisoner. The impact on English families was transformative as military service became profitable rather than burdensome. The Cobham family of Kent sent 4 sons to French wars during Edward's reign. 3 returned with enough loot to purchase additional manor houses. The youngest son became a knight through his military service and married into minor nobility. War had become a ladder of social mobility for ambitious families, but the English military success also created new problems. Soldiers returning from France were difficult to control during peacetime. They had learned that violence could be profitable and weren't willing to return to peaceful farming quietly. Bands of unemployed mercenaries roamed England looking for new employers or plunder opportunities. Military success created social instability at home. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 seemed to end the war on completely favourable terms for England. Edward III renounced his claim to the French throne in exchange for full sovereignty over Aquitaine, Calais, and other conquered territories. King John's ransom was confirmed at 3 million écus. England had won everything it could reasonably expect from military victory, but this apparent triumph contained seeds of future disaster. The treaty was impossibly favourable to England and couldn't survive French recovery. The enormous ransom payments crippled French finances but also motivated French resistance. Most importantly, English success had created expectations of continued military glory that would be difficult to maintain indefinitely. The year 1348 changed everything in medieval England. Ships arriving at Melcombe Regis in Dorset carried more than wool and wine. They brought Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. Within months, this microscopic killer would transform English society more dramatically than any military conquest. The medieval world was about to end in the most horrible way imaginable. The plague's arrival was preceded by terrifying reports from continental Europe. Travellers described whole cities abandoned with corpses rotting in empty streets. They told stories of families wiping out overnight, of monasteries where every monk died within days. Genoese merchants brought news that half of Europe's population had already perished. But nothing could prepare England for the reality of plague. The symptoms of bubonic plague were unmistakable and terrifying. Victims developed huge swellings called buboes in their armpits, groins, and necks. These could grow as large as apples and were incredibly painful. High fever and delirium followed quickly. Most victims died within 3 to 5 days of showing first symptoms. Some developed the pneumonic form and died even faster, coughing blood until they suffocated. Brother Thomas of Moe Abbey in Yorkshire left one of the most detailed accounts of plague's impact on religious communities. He watched 42 of his fellow monks die between September and December 1348. "We could not bury the dead fast enough," he wrote. "Bodies lay in the cloisters for days because there was no one left with strength to carry them to the cemetery." The plague spread through England with terrifying speed. It followed trade routes from port to port, then moved inland along major roads. London was struck in autumn 1348. By winter, plague had reached York and Durham. No region of England escaped completely. Even remote Scottish Highlands reported plague deaths by 1349. The island kingdom that had seemed safe from continental disasters found no protection from microscopic enemies. Royal attempts to fight the plague were pathetic and ineffective. Edward III's government tried to prevent infected ships from landing at English ports. They issued regulations requiring burial of plague victims within prescribed time limits. They banned public gatherings and religious processions. But medieval medicine had no understanding of disease transmission. Prayer and flight were the only real options available. The royal family's own experience with plague shows how it affected every level of society. Princess Joan, Edward III's daughter, died of plague in Bordeaux while travelling to marry Prince Peter of Castile. She was only 14 years old and apparently in perfect health when symptoms appeared. Her death in September 1348 brought the reality of plague directly into the royal household. Edward III and Queen Philippa tried to protect themselves by constant movement between different residences. They believed that staying in one place too long increased infection risk. The royal court travelled continuously throughout 1348, 1349, but this may have actually spread plague faster by carrying infected servants to new locations. Even kings and queens were helpless against plague. Village life collapsed completely in the worst affected areas. The manor of Tusmore in Oxfordshire lost 185 of its 200 residents between October 1348 and March 1349. Empty houses began falling down because no one remained to maintain them. Fields went unploughed because the farmers were dead. Livestock wandered freely because there were no shepherds to tend them. John ap Woad was the last survivor in the village of Little Stretton in Leicestershire. His wife and 4 children died within 1 week in November 1348. His elderly parents followed a few days later. John buried his entire family in his back garden because the parish priest was dead and the church was locked. He abandoned his farm in spring 1349 and was never seen again. The breakdown of religious life was particularly shocking to medieval people. Parish priests died at higher rates than lay people because they administered last rites to plague victims. Many parishes had no priest for months or even years. Bodies went unburied because no one remained to perform funeral services. Abandoned churches became shelters for wild animals and homeless survivors. Canterbury Cathedral's records show the human cost among England's religious elite. 4 archbishops of Canterbury died between 1348 and 1349. Thomas Bradwardine survived only 40 days after his consecration. His successor, John Offord, died before he could be enthroned. Simon Islip finally provided stable leadership when the worst of the plague ended in 1350. But plague also created opportunities for survivors. Labour shortages meant that surviving workers could demand higher wages and better conditions. Peasants who had been tied to manors for generations could now move freely to wherever employers offered the best terms. Traditional social hierarchies began breaking down when lords desperately needed workers and couldn't afford to be selective. The Statute of Labourers in 1351 shows how seriously the government took these social changes. Parliament tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from moving between employers. Anyone demanding higher wages could be imprisoned. Employers who paid above legal maximums faced heavy fines. But these laws were largely unenforceable because labour was so scarce. Empty villages became one of the plague's most visible legacies. Archaeologists have identified over 3,000 English villages that were abandoned during or shortly after the Black Death. Some were never reoccupied and exist today only as earthwork remains in farmers' fields. These lost villages are monuments to one of history's greatest demographic catastrophes. The psychological impact of plague may have been even greater than its physical effects. Survivors lived with constant fear that plague might return without warning. Traditional religious beliefs were shaken by the apparent randomness of death. Why did God allow innocent children to die horribly while some notorious sinners survived untouched? Medieval certainties about divine justice seemed hollow after plague's indiscriminate slaughter. Economic structures that had existed for centuries collapsed under plague's impact. The feudal system depended on large populations of bound peasants working lords' estates. When half the peasants died, the remaining workers could dictate their own terms. Lords who had inherited vast estates found themselves unable to work their lands profitably. Some noble families never recovered from plague's economic disruption. Women's roles in society changed dramatically after plague. So many men died that women inherited properties normally reserved for male heirs. Widows found themselves controlling businesses and estates. Some women entered occupations previously closed to them simply because there weren't enough male workers available. Plague created new opportunities even as it destroyed old certainties. The generational impact was particularly severe. Many families lost all their children, ending bloodlines that had continued for centuries. Surviving children often grew up as orphans with no knowledge of family traditions or inherited skills. Cultural knowledge accumulated over generations was lost forever when entire families died within days of each other. But English society proved remarkably resilient despite plague's devastation. New villages were established to replace abandoned ones. New families formed among plague survivors. Agricultural techniques adapted to smaller labour forces. Within a generation, England had developed new social and economic structures suited to post-plague realities. The medieval world had ended, but something recognisably English emerged from its ruins. By 1376, Edward III was no longer the magnificent king who had conquered France and captured kings. He was 64 years old, increasingly senile and dominated by his rapacious mistress Alice Perrers. The kingdom he had made great was being mismanaged by corrupt courtiers, while he played with his jewellery and reminisced about past victories. England needed strong leadership, but the great king was fading into a pathetic shadow of his former self. Alice Perrers had been one of Queen Philippa's ladies-in-waiting before becoming Edward's mistress around 1364. She was intelligent, ambitious, and completely unscrupulous about using her influence over the aging king. Alice accumulated vast estates, interfered in legal cases for money, and sold royal appointments to the highest bidders. Her corruption scandalised even the notoriously corrupt royal court. John of Gaunt, Edward's fourth son, had become the real power behind his father's throne. He was Duke of Lancaster through marriage, and claimed the throne of Castile through his second wife. But John's own ambitions made him an unreliable protector of royal authority. Many suspected he wanted to make himself king rather than preserve the throne for his nephew Richard. His unpopularity made royal government even more controversial. The Good Parliament of 1376 was the longest and most revolutionary session in medieval English history. It lasted from April to July and made unprecedented demands for governmental reform. The Commons elected Sir Peter de la Mare as their first official speaker, establishing a precedent that continues today. More dramatically, they demanded the right to impeach royal ministers for corruption and incompetence. The impeachment of Lord Latimer and Richard Lyons shocked the political establishment. William Latimer had been Edward's chamberlain for decades and controlled access to the king. Richard Lyons was a London merchant who had loaned money to the crown at extortionate interest rates. Both men were accused of embezzling royal revenues and abusing their positions for personal profit. Their trials established Parliament's right to hold royal officials accountable. But the Parliament's most controversial demand was the removal of Alice Perrers from court. The Commons claimed she had corrupted royal justice by interfering in legal cases. They accused her of stealing jewels that belonged to the late Queen Philippa. Most seriously, they argued that her influence over Edward was destroying royal dignity. A king's mistress had never faced such public criticism before. Sir Peter Delamere's speech attacking Alice Perrers was recorded by contemporary chroniclers. "She has wrapped our lord the king around her finger like a thread," he declared. "She sells justice like a merchant sells cloth. She treats the crown jewels as her private property. She has made our noble king a laughingstock among foreign princes." These were revolutionary words that challenged fundamental assumptions about royal private life. The Black Prince's illness and death during the Parliament added urgency to the reform demands. Edward of Woodstock had been England's greatest military hero and was expected to succeed his father as king. His death from dysentery on June 8, 1376, left the succession to his 9-year-old son Richard. The prospect of another minority reign made constitutional reform seem even more necessary. The Black Prince's final months were spent trying to protect his son's inheritance from John of Gaunt's ambitions. He made his father promise that Richard would succeed him as king. He arranged for trusted friends to serve as Richard's guardians and advisers. But the dying prince knew that his young son would face enormous challenges ruling a kingdom filled with powerful and ambitious adults. The good Parliament's reforms were systematically reversed after it ended. John of Gaunt used his influence over Edward III to recall Alice Perrers to court. The impeached ministers were pardoned and restored to their positions. Sir Peter Delamere was imprisoned in Nottingham Castle without trial. The next Parliament, meeting in 1377, obediently cancelled all the previous session's reforms. Parliamentary power proved temporary when royal authority recovered. But the precedents established by the good Parliament would prove enormously influential in later centuries. The principle that Parliament could impeach royal ministers became part of English constitutional tradition. The office of Speaker gave the Commons institutional continuity and leadership. Most importantly, the idea that royal government should be accountable to the nation's representatives had been articulated clearly for the first time. Edward III's death on June 21, 1377, ended the most successful reign in medieval English history. He had ruled for 50 years and transformed England from a weak, divided kingdom into Europe's dominant military power. His victories at Crécy and Poitiers had made English arms famous throughout Christendom. His capture of the French king had established England's prestige permanently. But Edward's final years had also revealed the limitations of personal monarchy. His senility and corruption had undone many of his earlier achievements. Military victories couldn't prevent domestic political problems. Individual royal character mattered more than institutional strength in determining governmental effectiveness. Edward's reign showed both the potential and the dangers of medieval kingship. The accession of 10-year-old Richard II created an immediate constitutional crisis. Minority reigns were always dangerous because adult nobles competed to control the child king. Richard's uncles, John of Gaunt, Edmund of Langley, and Thomas of Woodstock, all had their own ambitions and agendas. The kingdom that Edward III had made great now faced the prospect of civil war over the succession. The coronation of Richard II on July 16, 1377 was magnificent but ominous. The young king looked beautiful in his golden robes and crown, but he was clearly overwhelmed by the ceremony's grandeur. He had to be carried for part of the procession because he was too small to walk the entire route. England's future depended on this child's ability to master the art of kingship, while surrounded by ambitious adults who might exploit his youth and inexperience for their own purposes. The summer of 1381 began like any other medieval season. English peasants worked their fields under the hot sun. They paid their taxes to royal collectors. They attended mass in their parish churches. But beneath this ordinary surface, revolutionary anger was building. The common people had endured enough oppression. They were about to explode in the greatest popular uprising in English history. The immediate cause was yet another poll tax imposed by Richard II's government. Every person over 15 had to pay 1 shilling, a crushing burden for families already struggling with food shortages and plague disruption. Tax collectors went from door to door demanding money that most people simply didn't have. When families couldn't pay, collectors seized their possessions and threatened imprisonment. But the deeper causes of revolt went back decades. The Black Death had killed half of England's population, but surviving peasants found their lives getting worse rather than better. The Statute of Labourers tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Lords refused to allow peasants to leave their manors for better opportunities. The very people who had suffered most from plague now faced legal restrictions designed to keep them in poverty. Wat Tyler emerged as the revolt's leader almost by accident. He was a roof tiler from Dartford in Kent who had no experience with warfare or politics. But when a tax collector assaulted his teenage daughter, Tyler killed the man with his hammer. This act of paternal fury made him an outlaw. It also made him a symbol of common people's rage against official oppression. John Bull provided the revolt's intellectual justification. He was a priest who had been excommunicated for preaching radical ideas about social equality. Bull's famous question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" challenged the entire feudal system. If God had created all people equal, why should nobles rule over peasants? These ideas were revolutionary and dangerous to the established order. The revolt began in Kent and Essex simultaneously. Peasant armies marched on London from both directions. They burned tax records and destroyed manor houses. They executed royal officials and tax collectors wherever they found them. Most shocking of all, they demanded to meet with 14-year-old King Richard II personally. They believed the young king was their natural ally against corrupt ministers and greedy lords. Richard II was staying at the Tower of London when rebel armies reached the capital. His advisers were terrified and suggested fleeing to safety in France. But Richard showed remarkable courage for such a young boy. He agreed to meet the rebels at Mile End on June 14, 1381. This decision would define his entire reign and character. The meeting at Mile End was unlike anything in medieval history. Thousands of armed peasants gathered to hear their teenage king speak. Richard rode out with only a small guard, showing either incredible bravery or foolish naivety. When the rebels fell to their knees at his approach, Richard seemed genuinely moved by their devotion. He promised to grant their demands for freedom from serfdom and reasonable rents. But while Richard negotiated at Mile End, other rebels broke into the Tower of London. They dragged out Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Robert Hales, the treasurer. Both men were responsible for the hated poll tax. The rebels beheaded them on Tower Hill while crowds cheered. Their severed heads were displayed on London Bridge as warnings to other oppressive officials. The story of Thomas Baker shows how ordinary peasant families experienced the revolt. Thomas owned a small farm near Rochester, where he grew barely enough grain to feed his wife and 3 children. When tax collectors demanded 1 shilling from each family member, Thomas faced an impossible choice. He could sell his plough oxen to pay the tax, but then he couldn't work his fields. He could refuse to pay and face imprisonment or worse. Thomas's eldest son William was 16 and full of revolutionary enthusiasm. He joined Wat Tyler's army when it passed through Rochester. Thomas's wife Margaret begged her husband to stop their son from getting involved, but Thomas secretly supported William's decision. "Perhaps these great lords will finally learn that we common folk are human beings too," he told his wife. Thomas had no idea that his son would die at Smithfield 3 days later. The second meeting between Richard II and the rebels occurred at Smithfield on June 15th. Wat Tyler rode up to the king with apparent confidence. But something went wrong during their conversation. Tyler may have been drinking and spoke too boldly to royal dignity. When he reached for his dagger, the Mayor of London struck him down. Tyler died within minutes, gasping out his life in the mud. Richard's response to Tyler's death showed political genius beyond his years. The rebels were about to attack the royal party in revenge for their leader's murder. But Richard spurred his horse forward and shouted, "I am your king, I will be your leader." The crowd was so stunned by this 14-year-old's courage that they followed him meekly out of London. A child king had ended the greatest rebellion in English history through pure charisma. But Richard's promises at Mile End were immediately broken once the rebels dispersed. Royal armies hunted down revolt leaders throughout the summer. John Bull was captured and executed at St. Albans. Rebels who had received royal pardons were tried and hanged anyway. Richard's government claimed that promises made under duress weren't legally binding. The young king had learned that royal words could be weapons as sharp as swords. The judicial revenge was systematic and brutal. Chief Justice Tressilian travelled through Essex and Kent with armed retinues, hanging suspected rebels without proper trials. Over 1,500 people were executed during the summer of 1381. Entire villages were terrorised into submission. The message was clear. Common people who challenged royal authority would pay with their lives. Yet the peasants' revolt changed England permanently despite its apparent failure. Serfdom began disappearing gradually as lords found free wage labour more profitable than bound peasants. The poll tax was never imposed again. Most importantly, the idea that common people deserved consideration from their rulers had been planted in English political consciousness. These seeds would grow for centuries. The revolt also changed Richard II's understanding of royal power. He had seen how quickly loyal subjects could become dangerous rebels. He had learned that royal authority depended on fear as much as love. Most importantly, he had discovered his own ability to manipulate crowds through personal charisma. These lessons would shape his increasingly authoritarian approach to kingship. Personal accounts from rebel families show the revolt's lasting impact on ordinary people. Alice Perrers, not the king's former mistress but a peasant woman from Kent, lost her husband and 2 sons during the judicial revenge that followed. She was forced to sell her small holding to pay legal fees and move to London as a servant. But Alice never forgot that for a few glorious days common people had made kings and lords tremble with fear. The geographic spread of the revolt revealed deep-seated problems throughout English society. Rebellion occurred not just in Kent and Essex, but also in Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire and other counties. Urban workers joined rural peasants in attacking symbols of authority. This wasn't simply a local disturbance, but a nationwide expression of social grievances that royal government had ignored too long. Religious elements of the revolt were particularly threatening to established order. John Ball and other radical priests preached that God intended all people to be equal. They claimed that nobles' privileges were human inventions that contradicted divine law. These ideas challenged not just political hierarchy, but religious orthodoxy. The Church condemned such teachings as heretical and dangerous to social stability. Women played significant roles in the revolt despite medieval restrictions on their political participation. They provided food and shelter for rebel armies. They carried messages between different groups of insurgents. Some women fought alongside men in attacks on manor houses and government buildings. The revolt temporarily broke down normal gender roles along with social hierarchies. The international context made the revolt even more dangerous from the government's perspective. France was still technically at war with England despite recent truces. French agents might have encouraged English rebels to weaken their enemies' internal stability. Scotland remained hostile and could potentially exploit English domestic troubles. The revolt threatened national security as well as social order. But perhaps most importantly, the peasants' revolt demonstrated that royal authority had limits even in medieval society. Kings couldn't ignore their subjects' welfare indefinitely without facing serious consequences. Popular consent mattered more than political theorists admitted. Richard II had learned these lessons at 14 years old. Unfortunately, he would draw the wrong conclusions about how to manage them. Richard II was 20 years old in 1387 when he decided that being a constitutional monarch was intolerable. He had ruled under the guidance of noble councils and parliamentary oversight for a decade. He had watched his authority questioned and his policies overturned by men he considered his inferiors. The young king who had shown such promise at Smithfield was transforming into something far more dangerous, an absolute monarch who would tolerate no opposition. The Lords Appellant represented everything Richard hated about limited kingship. Thomas of Woodstock, his own uncle, led this group of 5 powerful nobles. They included Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin and closest friend since childhood. These men claimed they were protecting the realm from corrupt royal advisers. Richard saw them as traitors trying to steal his birthright as an anointed king. The immediate crisis began with Richard's favourite, Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Richard had made de Vere Marquess of Dublin and Duke of Ireland, titles that outraged traditional nobles who traced their lineage back centuries. When the Lords Appellant demanded de Vere's removal from court, Richard refused absolutely. He declared that he would rather give up his crown than abandon his chosen friends and advisers. But Richard's relationship with Robert de Vere was more than political favouritism. Contemporary chronicles hint at emotional intimacy that scandalised medieval opinion. They shared private chambers, exchanged expensive gifts, and communicated through coded messages. Whether sexual or simply deeply affectionate, their bond reminded everyone of Edward II's disastrous relationships with Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser. The Battle of Radcot Bridge on December 20th, 1387, destroyed Richard's attempt to rule through military force. De Vere had raised an army in Cheshire to restore royal authority, but the Lords Appellant intercepted him near Oxford with superior numbers. De Vere's forces scattered without serious fighting. The favourite himself escaped to France in disguise, abandoning Richard to face his enemies alone. The merciless Parliament of 1388 was aptly named. The Lords Appellant controlled proceedings completely and used their power to destroy Richard's supporters. They impeached, tried, and executed anyone who had encouraged royal resistance to their authority. Sir Simon Burley, Richard's beloved tutor, was beheaded despite the young king's tearful pleas for mercy. The lesson was clear. Richard's personal feelings meant nothing to practical politics. The judicial murder of Sir Simon Burley traumatized Richard more than any other event during the crisis. Burley had been like a father to him since childhood. The old knight had taught Richard to read, ride, and fight. He had protected the young king during the peasants' revolt and countless other dangers. Watching Burley die for loyalty to him convinced Richard that mercy was weakness his enemies would exploit ruthlessly. But the most profound change in Richard's character came from his marriage to Anne of Bohemia in 1382. Anne was intelligent, cultured, and genuinely devoted to her young husband. She softened Richard's harsh edges and encouraged his interest in art, literature, and learning. Their relationship became the emotional centre of Richard's life. He trusted Anne completely and valued her political advice above all his counsellors. Anne's intervention saved many lives during the merciless Parliament. She interceded personally for condemned men and arranged pardons for lesser offenders. Her tears moved even hardened lords to show occasional mercy. But Anne's compassion also made her suspect to the Lords Appellant. They whispered that she was too foreign, too influential, and too sympathetic to Richard's absolutist tendencies. The royal court that emerged after 1389 was unlike anything England had seen before. Richard surrounded himself with poets, artists and intellectuals from across Europe. Geoffrey Chaucer received royal patronage during these years. French and Italian fashions replaced traditional English styles. The court became a centre of cultural sophistication that rivaled Paris or Prague in its magnificence. But this cultural flowering came at enormous cost. Richard spent unprecedented sums on court ceremonies, artistic commissions and architectural projects. Westminster Hall was rebuilt with the most advanced engineering techniques available. The royal wardrobe budget exceeded the military expenses of most kingdoms. Parliament granted taxes reluctantly and criticised royal extravagance constantly. Richard's political philosophy during these years emphasised the divine nature of royal authority. He commissioned manuscripts that depicted him receiving his crown directly from Christ rather than through human intermediaries. His court ceremonies incorporated religious symbolism that suggested kings were God's earthly representatives. Anyone who opposed royal will was by definition opposing divine command. The invention of the royal badge of the White Hart represented Richard's new self-image perfectly. This elegant deer wore a golden crown around its neck, and represented both Richard's personal symbol and England's national identity. The White Hart appeared on royal documents, architectural decorations, and even servants' livery. It announced that Richard and England were inseparable. Then Anne of Bohemia died suddenly on June 7th, 1394. She was only 28 years old and had shown no signs of illness. Her death devastated Richard emotionally and changed his personality permanently. The young king, who had been merely authoritarian, became actively cruel. The man who had loved beauty began destroying anything that reminded him of his loss. Richard's grief over Anne's death was genuinely overwhelming. He ordered Sheen Palace demolished because he couldn't bear to live where they had been happy together. He struck the Earl of Arundel with his staff when the Earl arrived late to Anne's funeral. Most shocking of all, he remained unmarried for 2 years despite urgent political pressure to produce an heir. The creation of the Cheshire Guard marked Richard's final transformation into a tyrant. This was a personal army of 4,000 archers recruited from Richard's hereditary lands in Cheshire. They wore the royal badge of the White Hart and swore personal loyalty to Richard rather than to England. The Guard accompanied Richard everywhere and served as both bodyguards and enforcers of royal will. The Cheshire Guard functioned as medieval England's first secret police force. They investigated suspected disloyalty among nobles and commons alike. They arrested people for seditious speech and monitored private conversations. Anyone who criticised royal policy might find Cheshire archers at their door in the middle of the night. England was becoming a police state under its artistic and cultured king. Richard's second marriage to Isabella of Valois in 1396 was purely political and deeply unpopular. Isabella was only 6 years old, a child bride who couldn't possibly produce heirs for years. The French alliance this marriage represented seemed to prioritise foreign policy over English dynastic needs. Many nobles suspected Richard preferred his young wife's inability to challenge his authority or produce competing claimants to his throne. But Richard's worst mistake was his systematic revenge against the Lord's appellant who had humiliated him in 1387-1388. He waited nearly a decade for his opportunity, then struck without warning. Thomas of Woodstock was arrested and probably murdered in Calais. The Earl of Arundel was tried and executed. The Earl of Warwick was exiled to the Isle of Man. Only Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray initially escaped punishment. The confrontation between Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray in 1398 gave Richard his chance to eliminate both remaining Lords Appellant simultaneously. When they accused each other of treason, Richard arranged a trial by combat at Coventry. But just as the knights were about to fight, Richard stopped the combat and exiled both men instead. Bolingbroke received 10 years' exile while Mowbray was banished permanently. Richard's treatment of his cousin Henry Bolingbroke revealed the extent of his paranoia and cruelty. Henry had been his childhood companion and closest friend. They had played together as children and fought side by side during the peasants' revolt. But Richard now saw Henry as his most dangerous enemy precisely because of their former intimacy. Love had curdled into hatred and suspicion. The final catastrophe came when John of Gaunt died in February 1399. Henry Bolingbroke was the rightful heir to the vast Lancastrian estates, but Richard seized the inheritance for the crown and extended Henry's exile to life imprisonment. This was legal theft that violated fundamental principles of feudal law. Every noble family in England realised that their own property rights meant nothing if the king chose to ignore them. Personal accounts from this period show how Richard's tyranny affected individual families. Sir William Bagot had served Richard faithfully for years, but gradually became disgusted with royal brutality. He wrote to his brother that, "Our sovereign lord has become a stranger to mercy and justice." When Richard learned of this private criticism, Bagot fled to Ireland rather than face the Cheshire Guard's attention. The transformation of Richard II from the brave boy at Smithfield to the paranoid tyrant of the 1390s was one of medieval history's greatest tragedies. Personal grief, political frustration, and absolute power had corrupted a naturally intelligent and artistic personality. The king, who might have been England's greatest cultural patron, became instead a cautionary tale about power's ability to destroy those who wield it without restraint. But Richard's absolutist experiment was about to face its ultimate test. Henry Bolingbroke was gathering supporters in France and planning his return to England. The exiled duke had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from overthrowing his cousin's tyrannical regime. The usurpation that Richard's own behaviour had made inevitable was approaching rapidly. Henry Bolingbroke landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire on July 4, 1399. He brought fewer than 300 followers with him. Richard their son was campaigning in Ireland with 8,000 troops. By all logical calculations, Henry's invasion should have failed within weeks. But logic meant little when a kingdom had lost faith in its king completely. England was ready for revolution, and Henry provided the catalyst for change. The speed of Richard's collapse was breathtaking. Henry claimed he had returned only to reclaim his father's lands, not to seize the crown. But noble families flocked to join him as he marched south from Yorkshire. The Percy family of Northumberland brought their retainers. The Nevilles added their strength. Most significantly, Henry's own retainers from the Duchy of Lancaster rejoined their rightful lord eagerly. Richard received news of Henry's invasion while besieging a castle in the Irish mountains. His initial reaction was dismissive confidence. Henry was an exile with no money and few followers. The Cheshire Guard would crush this pathetic rebellion easily. But as reports of Henry's growing support reached Ireland, Richard's confidence transformed into panic and rage. The king's return to England was delayed by storms and adverse winds. Every day of delay allowed Henry to gather more supporters and consolidate his position. When Richard finally landed in Wales on July 27th, he found the principality largely hostile to his cause. Welsh lords remembered Richard's harsh taxation and arbitrary justice. They offered him no assistance against Henry's rebellion. Richard's attempts to rally support in Wales revealed the extent of his political isolation. The great fortress of Conway Castle, built by Edward the Somme to symbolise English power, became Richard's prison rather than his stronghold. Local Welsh leaders refused to provide supplies or reinforcements. Even Richard's own officials began deserting to Henry's cause when they realised which way the political wind was blowing. The decisive moment came when the Earl of Northumberland arrived at Conway Castle under a flag of truce. He claimed to be negotiating a peaceful settlement between Richard and Henry, but Henry Percy was actually luring Richard away from the safety of the castle walls. When Richard agreed to meet Henry personally, he rode into a trap that would cost him his crown and eventually his life. Richard's capture near Flint was ignominious rather than heroic. Henry's men surrounded the small royal party before Richard realised what was happening. The king, who had faced down rebel armies at 14, now surrendered meekly to his cousin's forces. There was no dramatic last stand or defiant speech. England's last Plantagenet king simply gave up when confronted with superior force. The journey from Flint to London was a royal progress in reverse. Richard rode as a prisoner while Henry received the acclaim of cheering crowds. Towns that had groaned under Richard's taxation welcomed Henry as a liberator. Nobles who had feared the Cheshire Guard openly celebrated Richard's downfall. The king, who had claimed divine authority, discovered that human loyalty was more practical than heavenly approval. Parliament's role in Richard's deposition was carefully managed to provide legal legitimacy for revolutionary action. Henry could have seized the crown by military conquest, but he preferred constitutional approval for his usurpation. A special commission declared that Richard had voluntarily abdicated his throne. Parliament then elected Henry as the new king by acclamation rather than hereditary right. Richard's formal abdication ceremony on September 29, 1399, was designed to humiliate him as completely as possible. He was forced to read aloud a statement confessing his unfitness to rule. He had to remove his crown, ring, and sceptre personally and hand them to Henry. The anointed king became a private person through his own spoken words rather than through violence or execution. But Henry's victory created as many problems as it solved. Richard was still alive and remained the rightful king in many people's opinions. Foreign powers might support Richard's restoration to destabilize Henry's regime. Domestic conspirators could rally around the deposed king's cause. As long as Richard breathed, Henry's throne remained insecure and illegitimate. The Epiphany rising of January 1400 proved Henry's fears were justified. A group of Richard's former supporters planned to murder Henry and restore their master to power. The plot was discovered just in time, and most conspirators were killed fighting or executed immediately afterward. But the conspiracy convinced Henry that Richard's continued existence posed an unacceptable threat to political stability. Richard's death at Pontefract Castle in February 1400 remains one of medieval history's great mysteries. Official records claimed he died of voluntary starvation, essentially suicide through self-imposed fasting. But contemporary rumours suggested murder by suffocation, poisoning, or violence. Henry displayed Richard's body publicly to prove he was really dead, but this only intensified speculation about the circumstances. The most likely explanation is that Henry ordered Richard's murder, but wanted to maintain plausible deniability about the deed. Medieval kingship required ruthless pragmatism, and Richard's death served Henry's political interests perfectly. But the guilt of regicide would haunt Henry for the rest of his reign, and curse his dynasty with civil warfare for generations. The personal tragedy of Richard II was that his genuine talents were corrupted by unlimited power and personal grief. He was intelligent, cultured, and capable of inspiring tremendous loyalty. His court fostered some of the greatest artistic achievements in English history, but absolute power revealed the worst aspects of his personality and destroyed his better instincts completely. Shakespeare's later portrayal of Richard II as a poet-king unsuited for practical politics captures something important about his character. Richard was more interested in the aesthetics of kingship than its harsh realities. He wanted to be loved and admired rather than feared and obeyed. This weakness made him vulnerable to harder men like Henry Bolingbroke, who understood that politics was ultimately about power rather than idealism. The curse of usurpation that began with Richard's deposition would dominate English politics for the next century. Henry IV gained the crown through force rather than hereditary right. This precedent encouraged future nobles to believe that successful rebellion could create legitimate monarchy. The Wars of the Roses were the ultimate consequence of Henry's revolution against Richard's tyranny. But Richard's fall also represented the triumph of parliamentary government over royal absolutism. The deposition proceedings established that English kings ruled by consent rather than divine right alone. Parliament's role in legitimising Henry's reign strengthened the institution's political importance. Constitutional monarchy emerged from the ruins of Richard's autocratic experiment. The ordinary people who had cheered Richard during the peasants' revolt felt no similar enthusiasm for his downfall 20 years later. They had learned that royal promises were worthless regardless of which individual wore the crown. The peasant families who had suffered during Richard's revenge in 1381 showed no interest in defending him against Henry's usurpation in 1399. Kings might rise and fall, but common people's lives remained equally hard regardless of dynastic changes. Henry Bolingbroke was crowned King Henry IV on October 13, 1399 in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was magnificent but haunted by the circumstances of his accession. Henry wore Richard II's crown and carried Richard's sceptre, but everyone knew these sacred objects had been taken by force rather than inherited by right. The new king's first words from the throne were a defensive justification of his usurpation rather than a confident assertion of royal authority. The guilt over Richard II's death consumed Henry from the beginning of his reign. He had not ordered the murder directly, but Richard's death served his interest too perfectly to be coincidental. Henry arranged for prayers to be said for Richard's soul, and even planned a crusade to the Holy Land as penance for his sins. But no amount of religious devotion could wash away the stain of regicide that marked his dynasty. Within months of his coronation, Henry faced the first of many rebellions that would plague his reign. The Epiphany Rising of January 1400 was led by Richard's former supporters who refused to accept the usurpation. They planned to murder Henry and his sons during a tournament at Windsor Castle. The plot failed, but its existence proved that Henry's throne remained desperately insecure despite Richard's death. The Percy family rebellion posed Henry's gravest military threat. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and his son Harry Hotspur had been Henry's crucial allies during the usurpation, but they quickly became disillusioned with their rewards and treatment. The Percys controlled the Scottish border and commanded the loyalty of thousands of armed retainers. Their rebellion in 1403 nearly ended Henry's reign before it was properly established. The Battle of Shrewsbury on July 21, 1403, was the closest Henry came to losing his crown through military defeat. Hotspur's rebel army included some of England's most experienced soldiers. They had fought the Scots for decades and knew how to handle themselves in battle. When they faced Henry's royal forces, both sides fought with the desperation of men whose lives depended on victory. Prince Hal's role at Shrewsbury began the legend that would make him England's greatest warrior king. The 16-year-old prince commanded part of his father's army and fought with remarkable courage despite his youth. An arrow struck him in the face during the battle, but he refused to leave the field until victory was assured. His bravery at Shrewsbury proved he was worthy to inherit his father's usurped crown. But Prince Hal's reputation between battles worried his father constantly. The young prince spent time in London taverns with criminals and prostitutes. He associated with men like Sir John Oldcastle, who would later lead a dangerous religious rebellion. Gossips claimed Hal was planning to depose his father and seize the crown for himself. These rumours probably reflected Henry's own guilty conscience about usurpation more than real evidence of filial disloyalty. The relationship between Henry IV and his eldest son was complicated by their different approaches to the burdens of kingship. Henry was serious, religious, and constantly worried about the legitimacy of his rule. Prince Hal seemed frivolous, irreligious, and careless about royal dignity. But perhaps the prince understood something his father didn't. That excessive seriousness about usurpation only drew attention to its illegitimate origins. The Scrope family story illustrates how Henry's usurpation tore apart even the most loyal noble families. William le Scrope had been Richard II's closest friend and had died defending him during the Epiphany Rising. His brother Henry Scrope initially accepted Henry IV's rule and received royal favour, but Henry Scrope eventually joined the Percy Rebellion and was executed for treason at York in 1405. Two brothers chose opposite sides in the dynastic conflict and both died for their loyalties. Owain Glyndwr's Welsh rebellion began as a personal dispute over land rights, but escalated into a full-scale war of national independence. Glyndwr was a Welsh gentleman who had received an English legal education and served in Richard II's army. But a boundary dispute with his English neighbour turned him into an outlaw, and from there into the leader of a Welsh resistance against English rule. The Welsh rebellion revealed the weakness of English control over the Celtic fringes of Britain. Wales had been conquered by Edward the Roan over a century earlier, but Welsh national identity remained strong. When Glyndwr proclaimed himself Prince of Wales and allied with France and Scotland, he was challenging not just Henry's rule, but the entire English imperial system in Britain. Henry's response to the Welsh rebellion was hampered by his lack of resources and legitimacy. Every campaign against Glyndwr required parliamentary approval and taxation. Members of Parliament questioned why they should pay to suppress rebellions that might not have occurred under a legitimate king. Henry's usurpation had weakened royal authority precisely when strong leadership was most needed. The mysterious illness that began affecting Henry around 1405 was widely interpreted as divine punishment for Richard II's murder. He developed painful skin lesions that contemporary doctors couldn't diagnose or treat. His hair fell out and his face became disfigured. Some chroniclers claimed he had contracted leprosy as God's judgment on regicide. Whether the illness was physical or psychological in origin, it clearly reflected Henry's tormented conscience. Henry's relationship with the Church was complicated by his need for legitimacy and his guilt over usurpation. He was more pious than most medieval kings and genuinely committed to religious reform, but he also needed Church support to justify his revolutionary seizure of power. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had crowned Henry, later developed doubts about the deposition's legitimacy and began distancing himself from royal policy. Parliament's power grew significantly during Henry's reign because his weak position made him dependent on parliamentary support. He needed frequent grants of taxation to fund military campaigns against rebellions. Members of Parliament used these opportunities to demand influence over royal appointments and policies. Constitutional government advanced through Henry's weakness rather than through deliberate royal policy. The social impact of constant rebellion and warfare was devastating for ordinary English families. The Goodwin family from Shropshire sent 3 sons to fight at Shrewsbury. The eldest son Thomas died in the battle fighting for the king. The second son William was wounded fighting for Hotspur and became a permanent invalid. Only the youngest son John survived intact, but he returned home to find the family farm burned during the campaign's aftermath. France's support for Henry's enemies prolonged rebellions and increased their danger to royal authority. French gold funded Welsh and Scottish resistance. French military advisors helped train rebel armies. Most importantly, French recognition of Glyndwr as legitimate Prince of Wales challenged English territorial claims in Britain itself. Henry faced a coordinated international conspiracy against his usurped throne. The suppression of the Lollard heresy became entangled with political rebellion during Henry's reign. Sir John Oldcastle, Prince Hal's former companion, led both a religious movement and an armed uprising against royal authority. His followers preached radical doctrines about church reform while plotting to assassinate the king. Henry was forced to choose between religious tolerance and political security, and he chose security ruthlessly. Henry IV died on March 20, 1413, in the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster Abbey. His death fulfilled a prophecy that he would die in Jerusalem, though the chamber's name rather than the Holy Land city satisfied the prediction technically. Henry had planned to go on crusade to expiate his sins, but never found the peace and stability needed to leave England safely. The deathbed scene between Henry IV and Prince Hal encapsulated all the tensions of the usurped reign. According to Shakespeare's later version, Henry advised his son that foreign wars would unite the kingdom and distract attention from the dynasty's illegitimate origins. Whether this conversation actually occurred, it perfectly captured Henry's political legacy. Successful usurpation followed by constant insecurity and guilt. Henry's greatest achievement was simply surviving on a throne he had seized illegally. Lesser men might have been overthrown within months by the rebellions he faced. His political skill, military ability, and sheer determination preserved the Lancastrian dynasty despite overwhelming challenges. But the price of survival was constant warfare that exhausted England and established precedents for future rebellions against royal authority. The transformation of Prince Hal into King Henry V was so dramatic that contemporaries believed it was miraculous. On March 21, 1413, the young man who had scandalised England with his tavern adventures became the most pious and determined monarch in medieval history. Henry dismissed his former companions immediately, embraced rigorous religious observance, and began planning the conquest of France. It was as if God had touched him personally at his coronation. Henry's first act as king was healing the wounds left by his father's usurpation. He arranged for Richard II's body to be moved from obscure burial at King's Langley to a magnificent tomb in Westminster Abbey. He pardoned the children of nobles executed for opposing his father. He even negotiated with surviving Welsh rebels to end Glinda's long resistance. Henry understood that legitimate kingship required reconciliation rather than continued persecution. But Henry's most important decision was renewing the war with France. The 100 Years' War had been dormant for a generation, but Henry saw French conquest as both his royal duty and political necessity. External warfare would unite England behind his leadership and establish his dynasty's legitimacy through military glory. If Henry couldn't be the rightful king by birth, he would become the greatest king through achievement. The legal basis for Henry's French claims was complex but politically useful. He revived Edward III's assertion that English kings were rightful heirs to the French throne. He also demanded territories in Aquitaine that had been lost during previous reigns. Most importantly, he insisted on marrying Catherine of Valois to cement his dynastic rights through marriage alliance. These claims gave moral justification for what was essentially a war of conquest. Henry's religious obsessions distinguished him from most medieval kings. He attended Mass multiple times daily and spent hours in private prayer. He wore hair shirts next to his skin as penance for unknown sins. He consulted theologians about the ethics of warfare and insisted that his French campaign was divinely commanded. Henry genuinely believed God had chosen him to purify both England and France through military conquest. The preparation for the French campaign revealed Henry's extraordinary administrative abilities. He assembled the largest English army since Edward III's time through systematic recruitment and training. He organised supply lines that could maintain 15,000 men across the English Channel indefinitely. He negotiated with Italian bankers for the enormous loans needed to fund the expedition. Henry planned for total victory rather than limited raids. The siege of Harfleur in August 1415 nearly ended Henry's French adventure before it properly began. The town's defences were stronger than expected, and English casualties mounted alarmingly from disease and combat wounds. Henry himself fell seriously ill with dysentery and nearly died. When Harfleur finally surrendered after 5 weeks, Henry's army was too weakened to continue the campaign safely. Henry's decision to march to Calais rather than return to England immediately was either incredibly brave or dangerously foolish. His army was reduced to fewer than 6,000 effective soldiers. The French had assembled over 25,000 troops to intercept him. The English faced annihilation if they were forced to fight a major battle. But Henry trusted in divine providence and his soldiers' discipline to carry them through impossible odds. The Battle of Agincourt on October 25, 1415, became the most famous English military victory in medieval history. Henry positioned his army between two woods that prevented French numerical superiority from being decisive. English longbowmen repeated their ancestors' triumphs at Crécy and Poitiers by slaughtering French cavalry with massed arrow fire, but Agincourt was even more one-sided than these earlier victories. The massacre of French prisoners during Agincourt shocked even hardened medieval warriors. When Henry learned that French reinforcements were threatening his baggage train, he ordered the execution of thousands of captured nobles and knights. This violation of chivalric customs was militarily necessary but morally troubling. Henry's saintly reputation was built on such ruthless pragmatism disguised as religious duty. Thomas Elmham, a royal chaplain who accompanied Henry's army, left vivid descriptions of the king's behaviour during the French campaign. He described Henry praying before battle while wearing full armour. He recorded the king's speeches encouraging soldiers to fight for God and England. Most remarkably, he noted Henry's personal participation in hand-to-hand combat despite his royal dignity. This warrior king fought alongside common soldiers rather than directing battles from safe positions. The story of William Porter, an archer from Gloucestershire, shows how ordinary soldiers experienced Agincourt. William had joined Henry's army hoping to make his fortune through military service. At Agincourt he shot nearly 60 arrows during the French cavalry charges. After the battle he found himself wealthy from captured French equipment and ransom payments. William returned to England able to purchase his own farm and marry his longtime sweetheart. But Henry's greatest achievement was conquering Normandy systematically between 1417 and 1419. This wasn't simply raiding for plunder, but permanent occupation designed to establish English rule permanently. Henry built new castles, installed English garrisons, and encouraged English settlement. He was creating an English empire in France that would last for generations if properly maintained. The Siege of Rouen from July 1418 to January 1419 demonstrated Henry's combination of military skill and political ruthlessness. The city's resistance lasted 6 months and cost thousands of civilian lives from starvation and disease. Henry refused to allow non-combatants to leave the city, condemning them to death between his army and the defenders. When Rouen finally surrendered, Henry showed mercy to the survivors but had achieved victory through deliberate cruelty. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Valois in June 1420 represented the climax of his French conquests. Catherine was beautiful, intelligent, and genuinely devoted to her English husband despite the political circumstances of their union. The Treaty of Troyes that accompanied their marriage named Henry as heir to the French throne after Charles VI's death. Henry seemed on the verge of uniting England and France under a single crown. Personal accounts of Henry and Catherine's relationship reveal a surprisingly tender side of the warrior king's character. Catherine's letters to her sister describe Henry as gentle and affectionate in private despite his fierce public demeanour. She wrote that he spent hours teaching her English and discussing theology and politics. Their marriage was politically arranged but became genuinely loving within months. The birth of Prince Henry, later Henry VI, at Windsor Castle in December 1421, completed Henry V's transformation from usurper's son to legitimate dynasty founder. The baby prince represented the union of English and French royal blood. He would inherit both kingdoms when his father's conquests were complete. Henry had seemingly overcome his dynasty's original sin through military achievement and dynastic marriage. But Henry's obsession with completing the French conquest would ultimately destroy everything he had built. He returned to France for another campaign in 1421 despite his deteriorating health. The Siege of Meaux lasted from October 1421 to May 1422 and consumed the last of Henry's physical strength. He contracted dysentery during the siege and never recovered completely. Henry the Arve died at Bois de Vincennes on August 31, 1422, just 2 months before his 35th birthday. He had ruled for 9 years and achieved more than most kings accomplished in twice that time. His final words reportedly concerned the French campaign's continuation and his infant son's future. Even dying, Henry remained focused on military glory rather than personal concerns. The deathbed arrangements Henry made for his son's regency revealed his political wisdom despite his military obsessions. He appointed his brother John, Duke of Bedford, as regent in France, and his uncle Henry Beaufort as the main adviser in England. He excluded his youngest brother, Humphrey of Gloucester, from real power because of his reckless temperament. Henry understood that successful regencies required careful balance between ambitious adults. Henry V's reign represented medieval English kingship at its most successful and most dangerous. His military achievements established England as Europe's dominant power temporarily. His personal charisma and administrative abilities created unprecedented royal authority. But his conquests required constant warfare that exhausted England's resources and created enemies throughout Europe. Henry had built a glorious empire that only continued military success could maintain. The tragedy of Henry V was that his very success made failure inevitable. He had raised English expectations so high that any lesser achievement seemed like defeat. He had committed England to continental conquests that required resources the kingdom couldn't sustain indefinitely. Most fatally, he had died, leaving a 9-month-old baby to inherit responsibilities that had challenged even his exceptional abilities. The greatest medieval king had created problems that would destroy his dynasty within 2 generations. Henry VI became King of England when he was 9 months old. No English king had ever inherited the throne at such a young age. The baby who gurgled in his cradle at Windsor Castle was supposed to rule both England and France when he reached maturity. But the infant king would grow up to lose everything his father had won and drive his kingdom into the civil warfare that destroyed medieval monarchy forever. The regency councils that governed during Henry's minority were divided from the beginning. In England, Cardinal Henry Beaufort and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, competed constantly for control over royal policy. In France, John, Duke of Bedford, fought desperately to maintain English conquests against Joan of Arc's inspired French resistance. The 2-headed government that Henry V had created couldn't function effectively without his personal authority to coordinate it. Joan of Arc's appearance in 1429 transformed the French war completely. This peasant girl from Lorraine claimed God had commanded her to drive the English from France and crown the Dauphin Charles at Reims Cathedral. Her military successes at Orleans and Bataille broke the spell of English invincibility that Henry V had created. More importantly, she provided French resistance with religious legitimacy that matched English claims to divine favour. The coronation of Henry VI in Westminster Abbey in 1429 was magnificent but desperately premature. The 7-year-old king was too young to understand the ceremony's significance and had to be coached in his responses. The crown kept slipping down over his eyes during the service. This pathetic spectacle convinced many observers that the Lancastrian dynasty was doomed to failure despite its recent military triumphs. Henry's second coronation in Paris in 1431 was an even more obvious disaster. French attendance was minimal, and hostile crowds gathered outside Notre Dame Cathedral. The young king appeared frightened throughout the ceremony, and stammered his responses to the liturgical questions. This coronation established Henry's theoretical claim to the French throne, but demonstrated practically that English rule in France was collapsing rapidly. As Henry VI reached adulthood, his unfitness for medieval kingship became increasingly obvious. He was pious, gentle, and genuinely interested in education and the arts. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, as monuments to learning and devotion. But Henry showed no interest in military affairs, financial management, or the political manoeuvring that successful kingship required. England needed another Henry V, but received a scholarly monk instead. Henry's mental illness first appeared in 1453 when he suffered a complete breakdown that lasted over a year. He became catatonic, unable to recognize friends or family members. He couldn't speak coherently or care for himself physically. Contemporary doctors had no understanding of mental illness and could offer no effective treatment. England faced the prospect of a permanently insane king ruling over increasingly desperate circumstances. The loss of Normandy in 1450 marked the beginning of the end for English rule in France. French armies reconquered territories that Henry V had spent years capturing and fortifying. English garrisons were overwhelmed or surrendered without serious resistance. By 1453, only Calais remained of the vast continental empire that had once stretched from the English Channel to the Loire Valley. The final disaster came at Castillon in 1453 when English forces were destroyed attempting to reconquer Aquitaine. This was England's last major military effort in the 100 Years' War. The defeat eliminated English power in southwestern France permanently and ended 3 centuries of English territorial ambitions on the European continent. Henry VI had lost his father's conquests and his great-great-grandfather's inheritance within 30 years. The domestic impact of military failure was catastrophic for royal authority. English noble families had invested fortunes in French wars and expected profits from conquest to continue indefinitely. When military defeat made these investments worthless, the nobles blamed royal incompetence and demanded better leadership. The mythology of English military superiority that had sustained royal prestige since Crécy was shattered by a generation of defeats. But Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou in 1445 created new political problems rather than solving existing ones. Margaret was intelligent, determined, and utterly ruthless in defending her husband's interests. She understood that Henry's weakness made him vulnerable to ambitious nobles who might prefer a stronger king. Her solution was eliminating potential rivals through political manipulation and, when necessary, armed force. The birth of Prince Edward in 1453 should have secured the Lancastrian dynasty's future. Instead, it created a succession crisis that triggered civil war. Richard, Duke of York, had been heir presumptive during Henry's childless years and had built a political following based on expectations of eventual succession. When Margaret's son displaced York's claims, the disappointed Duke began planning armed resistance to Lancastrian rule. York's grievances against Henry VI's government were both personal and principled. His family had been systematically excluded from royal favour despite their service to earlier Lancastrian kings. His advice on French policy had been ignored with disastrous results. Most importantly, he genuinely believed that better royal leadership could restore English greatness and prevent the kingdom's continuing decline into weakness and division. The Wars of the Roses began at the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, when York's forces attempted to remove Henry VI's incompetent advisers by force. The battle itself was brief and decisive. York's victory in less than an hour killed several leading Lancastrian nobles and captured the king himself. But this military success only marked the beginning of a dynastic struggle that would consume English political life for the next 30 years. The Wars of the Roses began as a family argument that spiralled into national catastrophe. Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, was Henry VI's cousin and had served the Lancastrian kings faithfully for decades. But by 1450, York was convinced that Henry's incompetent government was destroying England. The kingdom that had once dominated Europe was losing its French territories, facing bankruptcy, and descending into lawlessness. Someone had to save England from its weak king. York's claim to the throne was actually stronger than Henry VI by strict hereditary law. His great-great-grandmother was Philippa, daughter of Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second son. Henry VI descended from John of Gaunt, Edward III's third son. York's supporters argued that descent through an older son created superior royal rights. This genealogical dispute would justify 30 years of civil warfare. But York's initial goal wasn't usurping the crown. He wanted to reform Henry VI's government and restore English greatness through better leadership. York had governed Ireland successfully and commanded English forces in France with distinction. He genuinely believed he could save the Lancastrian dynasty from its own mistakes. His tragedy was that Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou refused to accept reform from their most dangerous rival. Margaret of Anjou transformed from royal wife to warrior queen when she realized that Henry's weakness threatened their son's inheritance. She was only 15 when she married Henry, but political necessity matured her quickly. Margaret understood that medieval kingship required strength and determination that her husband completely lacked. If Henry couldn't defend the crown, she would have to do it herself. Margaret's methods were ruthless but effective. She built a network of supporters among nobles who feared York's rise to power. She used royal patronage to reward loyalty and punish opposition. Most importantly, she convinced Henry to exclude York from government completely. This political warfare made compromise impossible and ensured that disputes would be settled through violence. The Neville family's division shows how the Wars of the Roses tore apart even the closest relationships. Ralph Neville, Earl of Westmoreland, had married twice and left children from both marriages. His older sons from his first marriage supported the Lancastrian cause. His younger sons from his second marriage joined York's rebellion. Brothers who had grown up together found themselves on opposite sides of a civil war that would kill several of them. William Neville's letters to his half-brother John reveal the personal anguish of family division. "I cannot understand how we have come to this," William wrote in 1455. "We shared the same nursery, learned our letters from the same tutor, and swore brotherhood as young men. Now I must consider you my enemy because you follow York's banner. God help us all if this madness continues much longer." The First Battle of St. Albans on May 22, 1455, marked the transition from political dispute to armed conflict. York's forces attacked the town where Henry VI was staying with his court. The battle lasted less than an hour, but its consequences echoed for generations. Several leading Lancastrian nobles died in the fighting, including Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, whose family would seek revenge for decades. King Henry VI's behaviour during the battle revealed his complete unfitness for medieval kingship. While his supporters fought and died defending him, Henry sat in a local inn reading religious books. An arrow wounded him in the neck, but he seemed more concerned about interrupting his prayers than about the battle's outcome. When York's forces captured him, Henry reportedly thanked God that the fighting had stopped. But the battle's immediate aftermath was even more significant than the fighting itself. York and his allies knelt before Henry VI and swore renewed loyalty to him personally. They claimed they had attacked his evil advisers, not the king himself. This fiction allowed both sides to avoid charges of treason while continuing their fundamental dispute about governmental control. The breakdown of law and order affected ordinary people more than noble political disputes. Thomas Malory, a Warwickshire gentleman, turned to banditry when royal justice collapsed. He robbed monasteries, kidnapped wealthy merchants, and terrorized his neighbours for years. Traditional authorities couldn't stop him because they were too busy fighting each other. Malory later wrote Le Morte d'Arthur while imprisoned, creating literature from lawlessness. Local feuds that had been contained by royal authority exploded into private wars during the 1450s. The Percy and Neville families fought for control of northern England. The Bonville and Courtenay families battled across Devon and Cornwall. The economic impact was devastating for merchant families who depended on political stability. The Seeley family of London wool merchants saw their profits collapse as civil war disrupted trade routes. Ships were seized by privateers claiming to serve one royal faction or another. Continental customers refused to honour contracts because they couldn't determine which English government was legitimate. Commercial prosperity required peace that neither side could provide. Margaret of Anjou's decision to ally with Scotland and France scandalised English opinion. She promised to surrender English border territories to Scotland in exchange for military support. She negotiated with French agents for troops and supplies. Margaret's foreign alliances made military sense, but they allowed York's supporters to claim she was selling England to its ancient enemies. The capture and rescue of Henry VI became a recurring theme throughout the early stages of the war. Both sides needed to control the king's person to claim governmental legitimacy. Henry was shuffled between York and Lancaster like a valuable but helpless prisoner. His mental illness made him unable to understand what was happening, but his royal status remained politically crucial regardless of his personal incapacity. York's protectorates in 1454 and 1455-1456 showed what his government might have accomplished with more time. He reformed royal finances, restored order in several troubled regions, and began negotiating realistic peace terms with France. But these achievements were reversed immediately when Henry VI recovered his sanity and Margaret regained control over royal policy. England lurched between competent and incompetent government depending on the king's mental state. The violence gradually escalated beyond what anyone had originally intended. The Battle of Blore Heath in 1459 saw over 2,000 casualties. The Battle of Northampton in 1460 resulted in York's temporary triumph and Henry's capture again. But each victory created new grievances that demanded revenge. The moderate voices calling for compromise were silenced by extremists on both sides who preferred military solutions to political problems. Richard, Duke of York's death at the Battle of Wakefield on December 30th, 1460, marked the point of no return in the dynastic conflict. York was killed along with his teenage son Edmund while fighting desperately outnumbered forces. Margaret's supporters cut off York's head and crowned it mockingly with a paper crown. This desecration of a royal claimant's corpse shocked even hardened warriors, and guaranteed that his surviving sons would seek bloody revenge. The paper crown incident became a symbol of how far England had fallen from medieval ideals of chivalric warfare. Previous conflicts had been fought with some respect for noble prisoners and fallen enemies. The Wars of the Roses abandoned these courtesies and descended into personal hatred that made reconciliation impossible. England was learning to hate itself through civil warfare. York's 18-year-old son, Edward, inherited both his father's claim to the throne and his desire for vengeance against the Lancastrians. The young man who would become Edward the Falter was tall, handsome, and charismatic, in ways that his serious father had never been. But Edward also possessed a ruthless determination to win at any cost. The boy who had watched his father's head mocked with a paper crown would show no mercy to his enemies when he gained the power to destroy them. Edward IV was 18 years old when his father's death made him the Yorkist claimant to England's throne. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. His golden hair and handsome face made him irresistible to women and inspiring to soldiers. But beneath this attractive exterior lay a calculating political mind that would make him one of medieval England's most successful usurper kings. Edward's first victory came at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross on February 2, 1461. He was marching to avenge his father's death when he encountered a Lancastrian army in the Welsh borderlands. Before the battle, 3 suns appeared in the morning sky, a rare atmospheric phenomenon called parhelion. Edward convinced his soldiers this was a divine sign of victory. He adopted the sun as his personal badge and won a crushing triumph that established his military reputation. The Battle of Towton on March 29, 1461, was the bloodiest single day in English history. Edward's Yorkist forces faced Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou's Lancastrian army in a Yorkshire snowstorm. An estimated 50,000 men fought for 10 hours in brutal hand-to-hand combat. When the slaughter ended, over 20,000 soldiers lay dead in the snow. Edward had won the crown through the most terrible battle England had ever witnessed. Edward's coronation on June 28, 1461, was magnificent but controversial. He was undeniably king by right of conquest, but Henry VI remained alive and at liberty in Scotland. Margaret of Anjou continued to claim royal authority for her husband and son. Edward ruled southern England effectively, but the northern counties remained loyal to the Lancastrian cause. England had 2 competing kings and no clear resolution to their dynastic dispute. The new king's approach to government was completely different from his father's serious reforms. Edward was young, energetic, and determined to make his court the centre of English political and social life. He hosted elaborate feasts, tournaments, and celebrations that attracted nobles from across Europe. But this magnificence served serious political purposes. It demonstrated that the Yorkist regime was stable, wealthy, and legitimate enough to command international respect. Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in May 1464 created the most serious crisis of his early reign. Elizabeth was a Lancastrian widow with 2 young sons from her first marriage. She was beautiful but not royal, wealthy or foreign, none of the usual qualifications for a queen consort. Worse still, Edward had married her privately without consulting his nobles or arranging any political alliance through the union. The Woodville family's rapid advancement scandalized the English nobility. Elizabeth's father was made Earl Rivers and Treasurer of England. Her brothers received important military commands and wealthy estates. Her sisters were married to the sons of England's greatest noble families. The Queen's relatives seemed to be monopolizing royal patronage, while traditional supporters received smaller rewards for their loyalty. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, became Edward's most dangerous enemy over the Woodville marriage. Warwick had been instrumental in Edward's victory and expected to control royal policy as a reward for his support. He was negotiating a French marriage alliance for Edward when the king's secret wedding was announced. Warwick felt personally betrayed and politically humiliated by Edward's independent action. The relationship between Edward IV and Warwick deteriorated rapidly through the mid-1460s. Warwick favoured alliance with France, while Edward preferred friendship with Burgundy. Warwick wanted aggressive prosecution of the war against remaining Lancastrians, while Edward sought reconciliation with former enemies. These policy disputes reflected deeper disagreements about whether Edward would be an independent king or Warwick's puppet. Court life under Edward the Eighth was more luxurious and culturally sophisticated than England had seen for generations. The king patronised artists, musicians, and scholars from across Europe. William Caxton established England's first printing press under royal protection. Italian craftsmen decorated royal palaces in the latest Renaissance styles. Edward's court rivaled those of France and Burgundy in magnificence and artistic achievement. But this cultural flowering came at enormous financial cost. Edward's court expenses exceeded those of his predecessors by vast amounts. His household consumed hundreds of tons of wine annually. His wardrobe included cloth of gold robes that cost more than most nobles' annual incomes. Parliament granted taxes reluctantly and criticised royal extravagance constantly. Edward's magnificence impressed foreign visitors but strained English resources dangerously. Edward's military campaigns in the late 1460s eliminated the remaining Lancastrian strongholds in northern England. The sieges of Bamburgh, Dunstanburgh, and Alnwick castles were conducted with unprecedented ruthlessness. Edward ordered that any defenders who continued resistance after walls were breached would be executed immediately. This threat convinced most garrisons to surrender rather than face massacre. The capture and execution of the last Lancastrian leaders marked the end of Henry VI's active cause. Sir Ralph Percy, who had surrendered and been pardoned twice before, was killed fighting at Hedgeley Moor in 1464. His death ended the Percy family's leadership of northern resistance. When Henry VI himself was captured in Lancashire in 1465, the Lancastrian cause seemed finished permanently. Warwick's rebellion in 1469-1470 was the most dangerous threat Edward IV faced during his reign. The Earl allied with Edward's own brother George, Duke of Clarence, and invaded England with French support. They captured Edward at the Battle of Edgecote and attempted to rule England through him as a puppet king. But Warwick discovered that governing through a captive monarch was practically impossible. The restoration of Henry VI in October 1470 seemed to reverse the entire course of the Wars of the Roses. Warwick brought Henry out of the Tower of London and proclaimed him king again after 9 years of Yorkist rule. Edward there fled to Burgundy with a handful of loyal supporters. The Lancastrian phoenix had risen from apparent death to reclaim its throne through the most unlikely circumstances. But Henry VI's second reign lasted only 6 months, and demonstrated his continued unfitness for kingship. The restored king was 50 years old, prematurely aged by mental illness, and completely controlled by Warwick and Margaret of Anjou. He attended royal ceremonies but showed no understanding of their significance. England was governed by competing factions using Henry's name rather than by royal authority. Edward's return from exile in March 1471 was one of the most dramatic comebacks in medieval history. He landed at Ravenspur, the same port Henry IV had used to begin his usurpation in 1399. Edward brought only 2,000 followers, but attracted supporters rapidly as he marched south. His brother Clarence defected from Warwick's cause and rejoined Edward just before the decisive battle. The Battle of Barnet on April 14, 1471 was fought in thick fog that created chaos for both armies. Warwick was killed during the fighting, ending the career of the man who had made and unmade kings for a decade. His death eliminated the last leader capable of coordinating Lancastrian resistance effectively. Edward had regained his crown by destroying the architect of his temporary overthrow. Margaret of Anjou's final defeat at the Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471 ended Lancastrian hopes permanently. Her 17-year-old son, Prince Edward, was killed during or immediately after the battle. With his death, the direct Lancastrian line became extinct. Margaret herself was captured and spent the rest of her life as Edward II's prisoner. The warrior queen who had fought for 20 years finally accepted defeat. The mysterious death of Henry VI in the Tower of London on May 21, 1471, eliminated the last Lancastrian claimant permanently. Official records claimed Henry died of melancholy upon learning of his son's death at Tewkesbury, but contemporary rumours suggested murder on Edward IV's orders. Henry's death was too convenient for the Yorkist cause to be entirely natural. Edward had learned from Henry VIII's experience that deposed kings must die to ensure dynastic security. Edward's second reign, from 1471 to 1483, was marked by unprecedented prosperity and political stability. He avoided expensive foreign wars and concentrated on restoring royal finances through efficient administration and commercial investment. He became the first English king since Henry II to die solvent. His court remained magnificent but was funded through trading profits rather than parliamentary taxation. The execution of Edward's brother George, Duke of Clarence, in 1478 showed the king's ruthless determination to prevent future rebellions. Clarence had betrayed Edward twice and shown himself incapable of loyal behaviour. When he began plotting again, Edward had him tried for treason and executed privately in the Tower of London. The tradition that Clarence was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine may be true or simply reflect contemporary views of his character, but Edward III's greatest failure was his neglect of the succession arrangements. He died suddenly on April 9, 1483, at age 40, leaving 2 young sons and no clear provisions for their protection. His brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named protector, but the Woodville family controlled the young King Edward V directly. The power struggle that followed would destroy the Yorkist dynasty and end medieval monarchy in England. Edward III's death was unexpected and may have been caused by overindulgence in food and alcohol rather than any specific illness. He had grown enormously fat in his later years and suffered from various ailments related to his lifestyle. His appetite for rich foods and strong drink was legendary at court. The warrior who had won his crown through military genius lost it through personal excess that shortened his life catastrophically. The summer of 1483 witnessed the most controversial usurpation in English history. Richard III had served his brother Edward loyally for 22 years. He was an experienced military commander and capable administrator. But when Edward died suddenly, leaving 2 young sons as heirs, Richard faced an impossible choice. He could serve as protector for his nephew Edward V, knowing the Woodville family would eventually destroy him, or he could seize the crown himself and destroy them first. Richard's initial actions as protector seemed legitimate and necessary. He arrested Earl Rivers and Richard Grey, the new King's Woodville relatives, at Stony Stratford on April 30th, 1483. He claimed they were planning to ambush him and seize control of the 12-year-old Edward V. Whether this plot was real or invented, Richard's preemptive strike gave him custody of the young king and effective control over the government. The disappearance of Edward V and his 9-year-old brother Richard from the Tower of London remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The 2 princes were seen playing in the Tower Gardens during June 1483, but no reliable witness reported seeing them after July. Richard III claimed they were safe but refused to produce them publicly. Their fate became the defining question of his controversial reign. The evidence for Richard's guilt in the prince's murder is circumstantial but compelling. He benefited enormously from their disappearance and had both opportunity and motive to kill them. His later behaviour suggested guilt and fear of discovery. Most importantly, no contemporary source suggested the princes had survived Richard's reign. If they had lived, Richard's enemies would have used them against him immediately. But Richard III's historical reputation may be unfairly blackened by Tudor propaganda written after his death. He governed England efficiently during his 2-year reign and showed genuine concern for justice and administrative reform. His legislation protected common people from noble oppression and encouraged trade and commerce. Richard may have been a child killer, but he was also a competent king who served England's interests effectively. The rebellion of Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, in October 1483 revealed the depth of opposition to Richard's usurpation. Buckingham had been Richard's crucial supporter during the seizure of power, but he turned against the king within months, possibly from guilt over the prince's fate or ambition for his own royal claims. Buckingham's rebellion failed quickly, but it encouraged other enemies to begin organising more serious resistance. Henry Tudor's claim to the English throne was genealogically weak but politically attractive to Richard's enemies. Henry descended from John of Gaunt through the illegitimate Beaufort line that had been explicitly barred from royal succession. But he also had a tenuous connection to the House of Lancaster through his mother, Margaret Beaufort. More importantly, he represented hope for change in a kingdom that had grown weary of civil warfare. The invasion force that sailed from Harfleur in August 1485 was pathetically small by medieval standards. Henry Tudor brought fewer than 3,000 men, mostly foreign mercenaries with no loyalty to England. He landed at Milford Haven in Wales, hoping to attract Welsh support, but his reception was lukewarm at best. Richard III commanded far superior forces and should have crushed this invasion easily. But Richard's support crumbled as Henry marched across Wales and into England. The Stanley family, who commanded thousands of troops, remained neutral despite their official loyalty to Richard. Other nobles declared for Henry or simply stayed home rather than fight for an unpopular king. Richard discovered that usurpation without popular consent created enemies who would betray him at the first opportunity. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, was decided by treachery rather than military skill. Richard III led a cavalry charge against Henry Tudor's position and came within yards of killing his rival personally. But Sir William Stanley's forces intervened at the crucial moment to save Henry and destroy Richard's attack. The king who had won his crown through betrayal lost it the same way. Richard III died as he had lived, fighting courageously against overwhelming odds. He refused offers to flee the battlefield and chose to die as a king rather than live as a fugitive. His body was found stripped naked among the common soldiers, so mutilated that he was initially unrecognizable. The last Plantagenet king ended 5 centuries of dynastic rule through personal bravery that couldn't overcome political isolation. The discovery of Richard's crown in a hawthorn bush after the battle became part of English royal legend. Lord Stanley placed the dented circlet on Henry Tudor's head while he knelt on Bosworth Field. This simple ceremony marked the end of medieval monarchy and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty that would transform England into a modern nation-state. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth was far from inevitable and could have been reversed easily by different circumstances. Richard III was the more experienced military commander and controlled superior resources. If the Stanley family had remained loyal, or if Richard's charge had succeeded, English history would have developed very differently. The Tudor myth of inevitable triumph was created after the fact to justify a fortunate but unlikely victory. The immediate aftermath of Bosworth showed how quickly political loyalties could shift in the face of military defeat. Nobles who had served Richard III for years immediately declared their devotion to Henry VII. Former enemies became instant allies when survival required adaptability. The Wars of the Roses had taught English elites that principles were less important than picking the winning side. But Bosworth Field represented more than just another dynastic change. It marked the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the Renaissance in England. Henry VII would govern through bureaucratic efficiency rather than feudal loyalty. He would use gunpowder weapons and professional armies instead of knightly cavalry. Most importantly, he would establish royal authority through financial control rather than military conquest alone. The mystery of the princes in the Tower would haunt English consciousness for centuries. Were they murdered on Richard III's orders, or did they die naturally from illness? Were they killed by Henry VII after Bosworth to eliminate rival claimants? The truth will probably never be known definitively, but their disappearance symbolized the moral corruption that civil warfare had brought to English politics. The Battle of Bosworth Field on that August morning in 1485 ended more than Richard III's life and reign. It closed the medieval chapter of English history that had begun with the Norman conquest over 4 centuries earlier. The world of knights and castles, feudal loyalty and divine kingship was giving way to something entirely new. Henry VII would rule through bureaucrats rather than barons, professional soldiers rather than feudal levies, and royal finances rather than personal charisma. The transformation was visible everywhere once you knew how to look. Gunpowder weapons were making medieval castle walls obsolete. Professional administrators were replacing noble-born courtiers in government positions. International trade was creating wealth that didn't depend on agricultural rents or military conquest. The printing press was spreading literacy beyond the church and nobility. England was becoming a modern nation-state while still thinking of itself as a medieval kingdom. But the human cost of reaching this new world had been enormous. The Wars of the Roses had killed 3 kings, dozens of noble families and thousands of ordinary soldiers. English population had declined from civil warfare, plague and economic disruption. The social fabric that had held medieval society together was torn beyond repair. England in 1485 was wealthier but less stable, more sophisticated but more brutal than the kingdom Edward I had ruled 2 centuries earlier. The great noble families that had dominated medieval England were largely extinct or broken by 1485. The Percy, Neville, Beaufort and Stafford lines had been destroyed through battle deaths, executions and political miscalculations. Henry VII deliberately avoided creating new nobles with extensive landed power. The Tudor monarchy would depend on royal bureaucrats and wealthy merchants rather than territorial magnates who could challenge royal authority. Yet medieval traditions survived in unexpected ways throughout the Tudor period and beyond. The monarchy retained its sacred character even as kings abandoned feudal government methods. Parliament continued to develop as an institution despite royal attempts to control it completely. English common law preserved medieval legal principles while adapting to Renaissance political needs. The past lived on within the new order that claimed to have replaced it. The ordinary people who had lived through this transformation adapted with remarkable resilience. Peasant families learned to work for wages rather than feudal service. Merchant families invested in trade rather than land acquisition. Craftsmen organized guilds that resembled medieval institutions but served modern economic functions. English society rebuilt itself around new principles while maintaining familiar social structures. Regional differences that had been crucial in medieval England began to fade under Tudor centralisation. Welsh resistance to English rule largely ended after Henry VII's Welsh ancestry made the Union more acceptable. Northern England's traditional independence was broken by royal policies that favoured southern merchants and administrators. Scotland remained separate but could no longer intervene decisively in English politics. Britain was becoming unified under English leadership for the first time since the Roman Empire. The Catholic Church that had shaped every aspect of medieval life was about to face its greatest crisis. Henry VIII's break with Rome would destroy the religious unity that had defined European Christian civilization. Monasteries that had preserved learning and provided charity for centuries would be dissolved and their wealth confiscated. The medieval synthesis of secular and spiritual authority would collapse within 50 years of Bosworth Field. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological rather than institutional. Medieval people had believed that society was ordained by God and couldn't be fundamentally altered by human action. Tudor subjects learned that political arrangements were human creations that could be modified through royal will or popular pressure. This intellectual revolution made possible everything from the English Reformation to the eventual development of democratic government. The stories of individual families who lived through this transformation reveal how gradually and unevenly change actually occurred. The Pastorn family of Norfolk continued to struggle with the same problems of land ownership, family marriages and local politics that had occupied their medieval ancestors. But they now wrote their letters in English rather than French, used printed books rather than hand-copied manuscripts, and appealed to royal courts rather than feudal lords for justice. London emerged from the medieval period as Europe's largest and most prosperous city. Its population grew from perhaps 50,000 in 1300 to over 200,000 by 1600. International merchants established permanent residence there rather than simply visiting for seasonal trade. Banking, insurance, and other financial services developed to support expanding commerce. London was becoming the economic heart of a commercial empire that would eventually span the globe. The military revolution was equally dramatic but less visible to contemporary observers. Castles that had dominated the landscape for centuries became ceremonial residences rather than functional fortresses. Professional soldiers replaced feudal levies as the backbone of royal armies. Naval power became more important than cavalry charges in determining national strength. England was preparing for the age of global conflict that would make it Europe's dominant power. Educational changes created new possibilities for social mobility that had been impossible in medieval society. Grammar schools began teaching merchant families' children alongside noble offspring. Universities expanded beyond training for church careers to include law, medicine, and natural philosophy. Literacy spread among craftsmen and farmers who needed to read contracts and account books. Knowledge was becoming a tool for advancement rather than simply a mark of social status. Yet many aspects of medieval life persisted well into the modern period. Agricultural techniques remained largely unchanged until the 18th century. Most people continued to live in small villages and follow seasonal rhythms that their ancestors had known for centuries. Traditional festivals and folk customs survived despite official attempts to suppress them. The medieval world died slowly in the English countryside even as it vanished quickly from royal courts and international politics. The legacy of medieval England shaped everything that followed in ways that contemporaries barely understood. Parliamentary government developed from medieval councils that had advised kings about taxation and justice. English common law spread throughout the world through colonial expansion. The English language that emerged from medieval fusion of Anglo-Saxon, French and Latin would become the closest thing to a global tongue. Medieval foundations supported structures that their builders could never have imagined. Standing in 2025 and looking back across the centuries, we can see patterns that were invisible to people living through them. The Norman conquest that seemed to end Anglo-Saxon England actually began its evolution into something uniquely English. The Black Death that appeared to destroy medieval civilization actually created opportunities for innovation and social change. The Wars of the Roses that seemed to prove the failure of medieval monarchy actually cleared the way for more effective royal government. The men and women whose stories we have followed would be astonished by the world their struggles created. Edward Thrust's conquest of Wales led eventually to voluntary union with England. The parliamentary conflicts of Edward II's reign produced constitutional monarchy. The peasants who revolted in 1381 began a process that would ultimately create democratic government. Medieval England died to give birth to the modern world, and both death and birth were necessary parts of the same historical process. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember that you are connected to every person whose story we have shared. The English language you speak was shaped by medieval poets and chroniclers. The legal traditions that protect your rights descended from medieval courts. The parliamentary democracy you may take for granted grew from medieval councils of barons and bishops. You are living within structures built by people who died 6 centuries ago, yet their work continues in ways they could never have foreseen. Medieval England is not dead. It lives on in the world they made for us.